Recording in progress.
Move. Come on, what's with the princess? Was who? I was mostly was a class which that's all was the correct.
The right job.
Yeah, right.
Good morning. Good morning.
Honorable members, good morning, and I take this opportunity to welcome you to the Portfolio Committee of International Relations. We welcome the staff from the Portfolio Committee. We also welcome members of the public who might be following the proceedings of our Portfolio Committee today. We welcome our usual friends, Sanusha and Dr. Mtembu. We are also welcoming some of the staff who are on the platform here from DERCO. Our agenda today, we are going to be dealing with a matter of the relations between South Africa and the United States of America. And just to bring to the attention of the members, Dr. Mtembu will not be with us for long because he has to leave the meeting around 9:45 to 10. And Sanusha will then continue with the meeting. We also know, honorable members, that at 2 o'clock, there is a budget which is happening at the CTICC, and members have to travel to the CTICC so that they can, on time, find their way there to the CTICC. So I'm going to request that whilst we spare no quality in as far as our work here today is concerned, we try and save time. Lubabalo, do we have apologies?
Good morning, Chair and honorable members. We do not have apologies, Jefferson. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you very much. I will not make any remarks, and therefore I will hand over to our dear friend who is always with us here in the Portfolio Committee, trying to make sure that we work with institutions and institutes, individuals and organizations to strengthen the relationship between the Portfolio Committee on behalf of Parliament, the people outside, including universities, colleges, and so on. So Dr. Mtembu Pilani, I'm now going to hand over to you to do the presentation. As I said, honorable members, we also have Sanusha, our dear friend. Sanusha, you are welcome too.
Thank you very much, Chair. Thank you for the invitation. I think it's quite a timely discussion, especially given the meeting that will take place later between the two presidents, President Trump and President Ramaphosa. I think sort of what we wanted to do, and we will do this presentation jointly, is where I will focus on the contextualization of the US-South Africa relationship. And then my colleague, Sanusha Naidu, will focus on the implications around oversight and also the way forward. There is I think there is a PowerPoint that has also been shared, so committee members will also have that with them. But what I wanted to do is just to firstly contextualize this relationship. Our presentation is basically titled Traversing Turbulent Waters of US-South Africa Relations and a Possible Oversight Approach. It is important because it's also taking place at a time when South Africa holds the presidency of the G20. And if we just look historically, is that the relationship has been quite complex and also multifaceted. There have always been contradictions within the relationship. And it's always been a relationship that South Africa has sought to manage. Because on some issues there's been alignment, and on some issues there has not been alignment. Already during the apartheid era, relations would waver between support for the anti-apartheid struggle on the one hand, and the US pursuing its own strategic interests in combating communism on the other. And so we know that it only came quite late that the US government itself would impose sanctions on South Africa. But we also know that at the time, even key figures within the liberation movement were branded terrorists. The organization itself branded as a terrorist organization. But despite that, there's always been a complexity in the relationship, in a sense that even though there was not the official support until quite late from the US government, there was always a maintenance of people-to-people relations between the anti-apartheid movement and the United States, people within the United States, civil society, certain members of Congress. And so it's always been a dynamic relationship, not always aligned in terms of interest, but it certainly, there's been a duality in the relationship, and that has characterized the two sides. The tensions that surround this duality underscore the competing challenges in contemporary relations. And these include ideological differences around alignment versus non-alignment. They also include positionality in terms of the West vis-a-vis the Global South and BRICS, and also socioeconomic struggles for justice, transformation, diversity, equity, and inclusivity. But also seeking a reformed, fair, and balanced level of power relations in the global system. So while South Africa has consistently been, at least since 1994, South Africa has consistently sought to reform the international architecture, the multilateral system. It's always, I just see something, a comment there. There is a presentation. I'm not sure if that could be flighted. I just see that in the comments. Someone was just asking whether there's a presentation. It was sent, so I think if it can be flighted, I think that would also be fine. But it will certainly be circulated also to the members.
Sorry, Dr. Pilani?
Yes, I think I just saw a comment which
no,
was...
you are right.
Yes.
You are right. I was thinking that during your opening remarks, it will be flighted. Lubabalo, just flight the presentation because it was sent.
Okay. No, perfect.
You can proceed, Dr. Pilani.
All right. No, they can just flight it and just put it on that first or second slide. I think in terms of just, South Africa has sought to reform the international architecture. So it has sought to reform, for instance, the United Nations. It has sought to reform the World Trade Organization, the International Monetary Fund, and also the World Bank. And this is something that has been quite consistent since South Africa's democratization. And it has sought to do that working with both countries in the Global South, but also with countries in the Global North, especially middle powers. Within that, at times, there has been a divergence of interests with the US, because at times the US has sought to resist some of those reform efforts, especially when it comes to the IMF and also the World Bank. And in more contemporary times, we've seen resistance from the US in terms of the reform of and functioning of the World Trade Organization. So there's basically been a consistent push and pull dynamics of the relationship, which serves as a constant reminder that Pretoria and Washington have not always shared a relationship based on mutual trust. And this is something that has continued to be a feature. Thank you. I see yes, I think that's fine if you keep it on that slide. Just to illustrate some of those issues around divergence and within some of the interests over the last 30 odd years. We've obviously seen that in the first half of South Africa's G20 presidency, that the US has basically sought to reorganize all of its international relations. And I think it's quite important to emphasize this. The US is reorganizing and resetting all of its international relations. So its focus on South Africa is not only, I think, something that we should treat as an isolated matter. It has also focused on the likes of Canada, on Mexico, on Denmark, fellow allies, even within NATO. And so it's pulled out of the Paris climate change agreement. It's pulled out of certain UN structures. It has cut 83% of its aid. This affects everyone. This is just to illustrate, some of this contextualization. And of course, we've also seen that it has not sent high-level representation both to the G20 ministers, foreign ministers meeting, and also to the meeting of that's driven by by the finance track within the G20. However, this absence should not be seen as a complete boycott, as they've sent sort of low-level officials to these meetings. Basically, the US is pursuing an America First policy and is reviewing its role in a multilateral structure. So in contextualizing this, I think this consistent push and pull dynamics in the relationship, it should not be seen as something that only begins under the Trump administration. This has been a consistent theme in South Africa-US relations since 1994, but also, as I state, even during the apartheid era, there was also this sort of push and pull dynamic in the relationship. What characterizes also some of these push and pull dynamics can also be seen in 1990, for instance, in a town hall that President Mandela attended in the US, where he had a town hall discussion with Ted Koppel. And during that town hall discussion, he was questioned over meetings with Yasser Arafat, Gaddafi, and Castro. And essentially, President Mandela said, in the 60s, the US was one of the first countries that the anti-apartheid movement sought to build a friendship with, especially as a democracy. It sought to gain support for its own fight against apartheid and for the democratization of South Africa. And these efforts were essentially rebuffed. And essentially what Mandela said is that whilst we appreciate the relations we have with the US and we will foster those relations with the US, it is not proper that the US essentially dictates who South Africa's friends should be and who its enemies should be. So I think this is just to emphasize the points that come up in this first slide that contextualizes this duality, this push and pull dynamics in the relationship. And whilst doing that, I think it's important whilst we understand the uniqueness of the Trump administration, it is important to contextualize that these push and pull dynamics are not only characterized by the Trump administration, but have actually been consistent both through Democratic or through Democrat and Republican administrations. So when we see, for instance, some of the tensions between South Africa and the US under the second Trump administration, it's important to note that even under the first Trump administration, we had to manage domestic and external expectations in a disruptive administration. So there were tensions even in the first administration around the US trade war with China. There were tensions around the US moving the US embassy to Jerusalem and its recognition of Israeli settlements in Palestine. There were also tensions under the first administration related to the US position on Morocco and Western Sahara. And so it is quite important that we do not overly emphasize Trump as a person, but we understand that this dynamic of push and pull has been something consistent in the relationship throughout the last 30 odd years. If we can go to the second slide, this is just basically, just highlighting obviously some of the ways in which in which some have sort of characterized the dynamics that currently face the relationship. I think what's important here is that going back to Gramsci is to highlight that the old is dying, but the new is yet to be born. So essentially what we are witnessing is a changing international order, a changing international landscape where we are moving essentially from what was characterized as a unipolar world order, where the US essentially had supremacy in terms of military, in terms of economic influence, but also cultural and other forms of influence. And what we have seen in recent years is a movement towards what some are characterizing as a multipolar world order, where it is becoming increasingly difficult for any one single power to dictate how essentially the world should go, or the direction in which the world should go. And during that period, what we see is we still see obviously challenges to the structural power dynamics, but we also see tensions. We see the US seeking to essentially at times disrupt a new order that is being formed to try and maintain its supremacy. I think, in this sense, it is important to understand that we are moving into a new world order. And certainly South Africa, in its efforts to strike a non-aligned position, finds itself also shaping in a way this emerging international order. And so what is also, I think, important here is that, you'll see, in the second sort of cartoon that is there, it's about essentially what role, what tensions have led, at least what position South Africa has adopted that have led to some of these tensions. We know that South Africa's case in the ICJ continues to be something that is heavily debated. It caused both tensions, both not just for the Republicans, but also for the Democrats within Congress. And so what is important there, and it goes back to what I was saying earlier around not concentrating all our analysis on the person of President Trump. It's important to understand that there are certain congressional processes that have been in place even preceding President Trump. So, for instance, already in March 2024, and this was under the Democrats, the U.S. House of Representatives Foreign Affairs Committee passed what was called at the time the U.S.-South Africa Bilateral Relations Review Act. And the aim of this was to investigate whether South Africa's actions are undermining U.S. national security or foreign policy interests. And so this subsequently made it to sort of operative clauses of the initial U.S.-South Africa bill. And this was all taking place under the Democrats. So certain congressional processes, once the Trump administration came in, there were already congressional processes underway that sought to review the relationship between South Africa and the US, because some members of Congress essentially felt that South Africa was taking positions that were against US interests. So these are some of the tensions, that sort of characterize this emerging global order. If we could go to the third slide. I think here again, this is really, I won't, sort of quote everything here, but I think it sorts to highlight that what is taking place in the United States should not be seen as a sort of a temporary anomaly. I think what happened under the first Trump administration is that many looked at President Trump as just a passing temporary figure in US politics. And I think this was an incorrect characterization of what was actually taking place within the United States. And so, countries around the world, especially European countries who have traditionally been close transatlantic partners of the US, they thought that what was happening was just a temporary thing, that President Trump was an anomaly and he would soon leave the political space and things would return to normality, or at least some form of normality. But I mean, what we see here is, and this is how, some have characterized what is happening in the US. We're seeing that there are more fundamental changes that are taking place inside of the US, which some of them will also outlive even the second Trump administration. They impact both the Republicans and they also impact the Democrats. So if you look at Francis Fukuyama, he underscores how the second term of Trump is no longer characterized by a chaotic or transactional approaches. He says, we are seeing a deliberate rollout of an effort to destroy the deep state. This is not chaos, though it may be perceived as such by those on the receiving end. The second mandate, however, is a rollout of a thoroughly prepared revenge towards any kind of values-based worldview. For years, the Heritage Foundation has been working on Trump's program known as Project 2025, and this project draws on the work of post-liberal thinkers who have emerged over the past decade. And so when we think about, this sort of MAGA movement, some have also said that the MAGA movement, which took over the Grand Old Party, broadly consists of two main streams of advocates. On the one hand, the post-liberal intellectuals led by Vance. On the other, the libertarian tech bros with Musk as the most prominent figure. These two streams share a common rejection and anger towards liberalism and democracy. They vowed to wage a culture war against individual freedom, division of power, checks and balances, pluralism, and tolerance deemed responsible for all social problems. So I think what is important to note here is that there are undercurrents within the US society that fundamentally reject the multilateral order as was created by previous US administrations, working with counterparts in Europe and in other parts of the world. They reject, sort of the multilateral system, the various international treaties that the United States has constructed since 1945, essentially. And you have a real pushback within the US society around what is, has been seen for many years as sort of conventional wisdom, has been, sort of this attack, as Fukuyama puts it, on what the current administration sees as the deep state. And so it's important as, South Africa continues to navigate this relationship to not treat this Trump administration as a temporary passing phase within the US. It should understand that some of the strong sort of pushback that we're seeing within the US, this pushback against the liberal architecture, which manifests itself in domestic US policy, but also which manifests itself in the foreign policy landscape. It's important to note that these are undercurrents that will essentially outlive the current administration. And so there is this anger and rejection towards liberalism. We're seeing it in the cultural wars within the US. And at times, South Africa also bears the brunt, because if we look, for instance, at some of the domestic legislation within the US, pushback, for instance, against LGBTQ, pushback against what the US administration characterizes as DEI, diversity, equity, and inclusiveness. Some of those things, the current US administration sees them as what characterizes South Africa, so sort of South Africa's efforts, let's say, at building a non-racial economy, at being inclusive in terms of LGBTQ rights and safeguarding those. All of those things are at times seen by certain influential figures within the current administration as a sort of antithesis of what the current administration is really pushing for. And on that basis, Secretary of State Marco Rubio said essentially they cannot support South Africa's G20 priorities, which are centered on solidarity, but also which are centered around, sustainability or sustainable development, and also in pushing for inclusive economic growth around the world. So essentially, some of those things, I think, were seen as essentially not in line with the current administration's priorities. I sort of just end, my section before with this, slide, and then I'll just elaborate on some of the issues before Sanusha comes in. What's important to note here is that essentially the complexities that surround this engagement, and as I've said this before, it's not just about the Republican Party. These are bipartisan issues. So, one of the things that unite both the Democrats and the Republicans, for instance, is they see China as a threat. And in their own thinking. They argue that South Africa is moving away from the West, essentially. They are seeing South Africa as somehow being anti anti-US, and this is something that is bipartisan. It's not solely about the Republicans. And the return, obviously, of the Trump presidency serves as a catalyst for deteriorating engagement over the past decade and beyond. So what we see now is really the height of this push and pull factors that we've seen over the last 30 odd years in the relationship between South Africa and the US. And as I've stated, is that it's much more than just a South African issue. This pertains to a larger, more existential threat of diversity, equity, and inclusion, both at home and globally. And of course, these are themes within our G20, as highlighted: solidarity, equality, and sustainability. There is definitely a frustration with South Africa's foreign policy leanings that can be interpreted as straying from the realm of friends versus interests. Also, I think what's important to note is that it's more than just the African Growth and Opportunity Act. I mean, firstly, some of the tariffs that have been placed on the auto manufacturing sector, but also just some of the other tariffs. We need to factor in that before Trump waged his sort of tariffs war, most tariffs that South African goods faced, at least outside of AGOA, were anywhere between 2% and 5% at most. And so there's been a massive escalation in terms of tariffs, and that essentially almost kills AGOA. So the reality is that even the ending of AGOA is not just a South African issue. This is an internal US issue, where the US has cut, funding for things like Power Africa. It's cut massively its presence in Africa, or it's in the process of cutting it, through the Department of States and the reconfiguration of the State Department. It is also cutting huge, programs like PEPFAR within the continent. However, this is not, and again, this should not just be seen as only an attack, let's say, on South Africa or on Africa. The reality is that the broader aid landscape has been changing. And this also precedes the current Trump administration. So European countries, their commitments to development aid have also been on the decline in recent years, as European countries have reprioritized some of their aid funding, for instance, towards military expenditure and also towards the war in Ukraine. So there has been a steady decline of development assistance funding that precedes the Trump administration, but the Trump administration accentuates those trends. And so we've seen a cutting of aid. Of course, something that should continue to worry us are things like misinformation and disinformation of reality, and the interference in domestic affairs of a sovereign state. And this is, again, not just about South Africa. I mean, think about if you are a Canadian member of parliament and your neighbor consistently speaks about annexing you and including you as a US state. I mean, think about if you are a NATO ally, if you are Denmark, and your ally continues to speak about the possibility of taking a large, chunk of what you consider part of your territory through Greenland. Think about the Panama Canal and all of those issues. So this is not just about interference in South Africa's domestic affairs when it comes to certain domestic legislation in South Africa. This is a broader trend that we see. It's about a US that is grappling with its own identity as a global actor to deepen its preponderance of power. And South Africa represents a mirror, one could argue, of the US struggling with its own weaknesses regarding race, class, and identity. And this mirror has two faces: on the domestic versus the international moral, ethical, and social justice struggles of all. For instance, in our case, the notion that the Freedom Charter highlights that South Africa belongs to all that live in it. Similarly, that the world belongs to all that live in it. And there are these tensions. There are those who obviously seek to create a more inclusive world, both at a national level, but also at an international level, who seek to democratize the multilateral system, make it more inclusive. And there are those who wish to have a more exclusive international order where certain countries are able to dictate and others simply have to follow. Now, and sort of, if you can go to the to the next slide. But before Sanusha comes in, just to emphasize some of the oversight dynamics, I'll just emphasize just a few points around, some of the trade dynamics between the US, which also highlight some of these tensions. We know that AGOA is obviously at risk, but it's important to note that our trade relations with the US are not characterized by AGOA. AGOA is important, yes. It came about in the year 2000. However, there have been efforts in the past to have a free trade agreement between South Africa and the US. These were not successful, and this possibly presents an opportunity to revive some of those discussions. So in 2002, for instance, the US and the countries of the Southern African Customs Union announced that they would begin negotiations towards a free trade agreement. Now, they had several rounds of negotiations, but without agreement on the free trade agreement. Negotiations were eventually suspended in 2006. And what eventually happened is that a trade investment and development cooperation agreement was signed on the 16th of July 2008 between the US and the Southern African Customs Union countries. Now, SACU countries are very important to the US because the 5 SACU countries together are the United States' largest non-oil trading partner in sub-Saharan Africa. But also the SACU countries comprise the largest US export market in sub-Saharan Africa. So the relationship between the US and South Africa is not a one-way stream. It is a mutually beneficial relationship. In fact, the US relies on South African metals and minerals that are essential for its economy and national security. The US is, if we think about South Africa having the world's largest reserves of chrome, gold, manganese, and platinum group metals. President Reagan in 1981 said something quite interesting. He said, South Africa is a country that stood by us in every war we've ever fought. This is in 1981. A country that strategically is essential to the free world in its production of minerals we all must have. And so when we think about this relationship, it's important to understand that it is a mutually beneficial relationship and is not a one-way stream. I mean, South Africa's exports in terms of metals and minerals, these are the largest South African exports to the US. And, already in 2021, the platinum group metals were almost half of South Africa's exports to the US. and nearly 100% of South Africa or of the US's global chromium supply comes from South Africa. And one of the reasons why this relationship is also important is that the U.S. Department of Defense essentially calls these minerals the building blocks of a thriving economy and a strong national defense. And so, South African companies also create jobs in the U.S. For instance. And so this is something that is quite important. This ensures that when engagements are had between our two countries, is that South Africa does have something to offer. And of course, the US also has something to offer. But going back, this is a push and pull, and it's a relationship that consistently has to be managed. The last issue that I will mention before Sanusha comes in is that there have been studies that have been conducted around what are the possible impacts of a loss of AGOA. I mentioned the free trade agreement as a possible entry point, a possible opportunity between South Africa and the US to negotiate. But also just to emphasize that indeed AGOA, we do not all have our eggs in the AGOA basket. A loss of AGOA would essentially have, sort of, yes, it's impactful, but in the broader scheme, models suggest that total production would fall by less than 0.1%, and that the effect would obviously be more profound in certain sectors than others. And that in total, a loss of AGOA benefits would lead to a GDP decline of about 0.06%, which is relatively small. But it's important to note that, again, most of our trade with the US is not through AGOA. And so some of the tariffs that the Trump administration has imposed, they do not affect significant parts of our trade, especially in the minerals and metals sector, because the US cannot afford to impose sanctions on those because they would disrupt supply to the US. And so this is something that is quite important. The critical minerals do matter to the US, and we do possess those. And of course, South Africa still remains an influential country within Africa and the global South, and hence the US seeks to also affect how South Africa positions itself in the world. So let me stop there, and then Sanusha can go into some of the oversight dynamics and also the way forward. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Dr. Pilani. Thanks for that input. Sanush, over to you.
Good morning, Chair. Good morning, honorable members. Thank you very much for the opportunity to provide insight into this very relevant, very timely, and of course, all of us will be watching the meeting later today between President Ramaphosa and President Trump. Just to continue from where Pilani had stopped, I mean, I think the critical point now in mapping out this relationship and the way this relationship has been evolving between the US and South Africa, and not just in terms of the presidency of Trump 1 and Trump 2, but rather the fact that it's an ongoing relationship that has moments of tension, moments of complexity, moments of tethering, but also, as Pilani rightly pointed out, it's a duality. It's a push and pull. There's a constant elasticity of how this relationship is crafted and characterized. And I think that makes us think more with regard to how do we then define, how do we then map out, but also how do we understand what a oversight role should be. Particularly in terms of the role of the committee, but also more broadly for Parliament. And the fact of the matter is that we need to start thinking about this oversight capacity and the oversight approach in the context of the slide number 2, where we looked at the architecture of the global international system. Because I think the system in itself is in a state of recalibration. we're not sure where we're going to in the current political economic architecture of the international system. We find ourselves in a state of constant uncertainty. And I think that the challenge there is, what are we looking for? Are we looking for the system to remain the same? But again, how do we define the power dynamics in the global architecture? How do we look towards the question of the reform agenda or the transformation agenda of the international governance institutions that underwrite the rules of the international system? And more importantly, how does this link back to a system that's in a state of flux? So we are actually entering that kind of vortex, if that makes sense, of an international system that is unpredictable, complex, uncertain, and we don't know what the future holds. So we're trying to find our dynamic and find our dimension of what is oversight in this world order that is in a state of a Gramscian identity, where the old is dying, the new is yet to be born. And in that integrum of where we are, we have a morbidity of consequences. And that is what Gramsci has put out in the context. Antonio Gramsci, the Italian Marxist philosopher, who put out in his diary when he was in prison, called the Prison Diaries. But the challenge for South Africa, I think, and it's a challenge not just South Africa, but I think the challenge for our colleagues and partners in Africa and more broadly is, how do we define our foreign policy interests and values? And what are the two ways in which those two issues are interconnected? And I use the analogy of an infinity light, basically because it's something that caught my attention recently. But an infinity light where you keep, it shows that that values and interests, can they be separated? Are they actually interdependent? Are they interconnected with each other? And it's something that I think the challenge for us is, how do we look at our values to advance our interests? And so the oversight issue is not just one dimensional. It's in my scenario that I'm looking at, is that it's interrelated, but it's also concentric circles, that what you do at the domestic affects the regional and the continental and affects the global and the international, while at the same time the global international affects the regional, affects the domestic. So it's this kind of integrated approach around where do we find our oversight. And our oversight, I think, is really to understand what is happening within the global international system and where do we posit our values and interests. Now, I know we have the national framework of the framework document on a national interest, and that's very much part of, I think, the first kind of foundation of the oversight that we take forward. But that oversight in terms of the framework document is one that needs constant updating. So this also applies to the idea that our policy information, our policy documents, our strategy documents cannot constantly remain just crafted in a broad articulation of what our values are. And then when we want to actually think of what the interests are, we have this disconnect, or we have also a duality and a tension in there. So this push and pull, but rather keeping in mind that the values are also now the same, but it also has to talk to the national interest. And how do they talk to the national interest in terms of not just the political dynamics, but also the government's policy of economic diplomacy? So the tensions that produce in terms of the investment that needs to come in, but also the question around, what does an FTA with the US look like, and the implications this would have for our engagements within the SACU region, particularly given the experience we had with the EU around the Trade Development and Cooperation Agreement that created tensions in SACU, because if you are in a customs union, and then you'll have to apply similar tariffs and you have a common external tariff policy. So are our interests in terms of South Africa's foreign policy, how do we link that to what is happening within the US? Our interest with the US, does it ventilate itself in terms of what is happening in the continent and more importantly, the region, SACU, SADC, the continent, and then, of course, the global. And then are those interests representing our values? So it's almost that kind of dynamic in terms of the duality, Chair. And it's very complicated right now because it cannot be only on a set of issues. It has to be on a set of the way in which all of these different circles are basically linked together in terms of what are our values and interests, both domestically, regionally, and continent and globally. Now, the challenge for most of the oversight is that the committee, as well as other committees in the National Assembly, have to start seeing this as a collective approach, that the concentric circle approach is not just on the idea that you're looking at foreign policy. I think the best way to explain foreign policy is that foreign policy is multidimensional. It cuts across the entire work stream and the executive work space of government. So it has to be interconnected, it has to be multidimensional, it has to be multi-issue as well. Because when you're thinking about this trade agreement that has been structured between the three departments and is possibly going to be discussed today within the meeting, or parts of it is going to be presented at the meeting between Presidents Trump and Ramaphosa, I think the question is, how does this link back to what is the national interest of the country? It cannot be that the national interest of the country is also only linked to particular ideas. It's not only about the Africa policy, it's also about a much broader question, because what's happening now in terms of the engagement between the USA and African countries is that it's happening bilaterally. And so the bilateral is really very much front and center. And so the challenge for us in the oversight discussion is really the questions around how do we deal with oversight? How do we engage with oversight beyond just the Department of International Relations and Cooperation? How do we actually develop perhaps a collective engagement, bringing in other departments to come in and also present their vision, their understanding, and what their engagement is? And then how does this then link up to things like the SADC summit, the SADC engagement, the SACU engagement, and the engagement around the Continental Free Trade Agreement? Because those are going to have very critical impacts for what kind of strategies we define. So if indeed we're thinking about the trade dynamic beyond AGOA, then what does this FTA with the US mean if indeed that's being negotiated? How does that impact on our relations with within the SACU, but also within the context of SADC, and also look at it not just in terms of trade, but the geopoliticization of trade, because trade is now becoming much more than just about access to markets and access to industries and investment. It's also about the critical minerals and the securitization of trade in that context, and what we're feeding into that trade. The second point here is also the question around the developmental agenda. The developmental agenda is much more than just how much of developmental architecture we create. It's not just about the numbers and the figures. It's beyond the numbers and figures. So one of the bigger challenges is around the question that Tolani had raised around PEPFAR and the cutting of aid for developmental projects. That means that we have to cover that cost, and that cost will have to be absorbed. And how will that happen? We hear the health minister say that South Africa will have to deal with the impact of the cutting of PEPFAR aid, but how does that impact on South Africa's healthcare industry? Now, this is something that we have to think about, not only in the direct relationship between the US and South Africa, but also the impacts this has on our socio-economic and the social development architecture at the domestic level. Should we be thinking about how our relationship not just with the US, but the relationship with other actors also starts to build up our developmental reservoir in terms of how do we start funding our programs at home. And so these are parts of the values and how does it advance our domestic interest, but also links up to the regional and the global. So in that context, I just want to come to the issue around what does oversight have to look like? I mean, I say strategic and patient, Chair, because I think that it's a world that we're living in that requires us to be much more than just looking at it from a perspective of reaction. And I think that what we need to think about there, is the challenge around where do we actually structure the strategy. And one of the things that we need to be careful of is this kind of megaphone diplomacy, the rhetoric that we need to be fast and furious. I think we need to be strategic and patient, but also within that strategic and patient engagement around the architecture of the oversight is to understand, have enough information, not just in terms of what's happening globally, but have enough information to assimilate, to digest, and then to assess, and to be able to then have a constant feed of engagement with a variety of actors that can offer the deeper reflection, not just think tanks, but I think civil society in general, people that are sitting in the US or as well as in other countries who can act as a feedback loop into understanding the architecture at the economic and social level and to see what's happening and how this is playing out in terms of that question. And this will then help us to also consider the way in which agency links to the issue of values and how this informs interests. Because I think the idea right now, Chair, is that we kind of trying to push forward a oversight engagement, but it's becoming one that is linked to a short-term engagement. I think for the next 20 to 25 years, we're going to be sitting in this vortex of where this new world order is trying to find itself, incubate itself, and try to find itself come to realization and fruition. And in that context, I think we're going to constantly have these push and pull factors. And so the challenge for us, I think, in the context of not just the oversight, but also in terms of how do we strategically realign our policy documents that give us a kind of long-term perspective, but also define it within medium and short-term dynamics, is that we have to understand that we're going to be sitting in this kind of architecture for a while. And so the strategic dynamics around the agency needs to understand that the Gramscian global order that is complex and unpredictable right now is that we're constantly going to be defining what is global governance, defining where do we go to in terms of South Africa and the fact that we are chairing the G20, but what happens after the G20. There's a very interesting piece that Professor Carlos Lopez from the Nelson Mandela School of Public Governance wrote recently in Daily Maverick, which is called The End of Consensus. And I think that's a critical point for us to bear in mind. He calls it consensus that is coming to an end based on the idea that what we saw as consensus in the global governance architecture, in the context of what were the rules-based system of this international system, has now come to a tipping point, and that what we had is a lot of discussion but no consensus on agreements. And I think part of our challenge in terms of oversight is that we're going to continue to see that this consensus that we have been driving towards in the context of whether it's the US-South Africa relationship or whether it is the bigger challenges around the global order, is that the consensus is going to be quite difficult to achieve. And he actually argues that the idea of consensus in the last 30 to 35 years was actually artificial and fake. And so what you really don't have is agreements. agreements that solidify, agreements that provide implementation, agreements that actually provide a trajectory of what needs to be done, because everything has been very fluid. And I think that in itself, Chair, is really where we are in the context of the oversight dynamic. And so we need to start thinking about where are we going to within the context of what is oversight, how do we need to filter out the white noise around some of the issues. And more importantly, I think we need to recognize, but also accept that this global order is not going to be the same, that we are entering that kind of dystopian global order where it's about how countries are looking at the bilateral, looking at their selves first, and then trying to negotiate. And so this is where we need to think about what is a much more applicable, much more reflective, but also a strategic oversight role to play. And this requires constant feeding, constant engagement with stakeholders across the range, across the section of actors that understand what or can give us the feedback and the kind of reflection that we need. I've noted that one of the honorable members need to leave, so I'll stop here, Chair, and then we can take questions and answers.
Thank you very much, Sanusha and Pilani. Thanks very much. As you said, today's discussion in a portfolio committee coincidentally is taking place on the day President Ramaphosa will be meeting President Donald Trump. I'm now going to ask members to, I won't say anything. I just want members to raise their hands and let's see who wants to talk first. Ngobile, Honorable Ngobile Mhlongo.
Thank you.
I like the advert on TV when you were interviewed by. I like that advert. I'm sure you know it,
Chair.
Honorable Mhlongo. Go on now.
Thank you, Chair. Greetings to yourself, greetings to other MPs, greetings to Institute for Global Dialogue, our staff members that are here today, and South Africans who are interested in the proceedings of International Relations and Cooperation Committee. Chair, let's firstly say that we welcome this presentation by Global Dialogue. However, Chair, we are discussing a matter of not only national importance, it's of international importance. And while we're discussing this, Chair, in our midst, we don't have the minister or the deputy minister or even senior officials from DERCO. So I will say, Chair, moving forward, or propose that moving forward, when we have any discussions in this committee, let's not only bring the think tanks, let's have either the minister or deputy minister present in our midst, as well as officials, senior officials from DERCO, who must come here and answer some of the questions that we have. Think tank can only answer questions based on the information that is available, but we need also accountability and to play oversight and on the work that is done by DERCO in implementing and handling foreign policy of our country. Now, Chair, we want to take this opportunity to firstly condemn the reports that President Ramaphosa is set to offer regulatory assurances. I think there's someone else speaking, Chair. Okay. Now,
Lubabalo, can you check what's happening? Continue on.
I must continue, Chair.
Proceed, Honorable Mhlongo.
Thank you. So we must really condemn the reports that are coming out that President Ramaphosa is set to offer regulatory assurances to Elon Musk Starlink company. This move by Ramaphosa is not only unconstitutional, Chair, it also exposes President Ramaphosa as willing to compromise our sovereignty to massage the inflated ego of Elon Musk and Donald Trump. We must remind the public and the president that Mr. Ramaphosa, the president of South Africa, has no executive authority to unilaterally guarantee access to South Africa's telecommunications sector, let alone bypass necessary BEE laws. Now, the EFF has observed the frantic and irrational actions by the US President Donald Trump since the 7th of February this year, who has signed executive orders halting foreign aid and assistance to South Africa and has offered or made an offer to white Afrikaners to take up refugee resettlement program in the US. Now, as the EFF, we really take serious exception on the nefarious misinformation spread by Trump's administration that there's a genocide against white South African families. These lies perpetuated by both AfriForum and Solidarity, the two most racist and treasonous organizations in our country. Surprisingly, Chair, leaders of both AfriForum and Solidarity have not taken up that offer to go and be refugees in the US. If there's a genocide, why those who are accusing the state of such are not really taking up this offer? Because they're afraid of going to the US to be refugees, to be hobos, to be landless. They know that the white privileges that they enjoy in South Africa, they will never enjoy such privileges in the US. We must also, Chair, in this spirit, welcome the departure of the 49 racists with questionable intentions who voluntarily departed from South Africa to go and be refugees in the US. We hope they stay there forever. But it's quite laughable that victims of genocide had the pleasure and time to pack up bags, relocate nicely. Really, this is it's a new thing. We've never seen victims of genocide having time to pack up and live nicely at an airport, safely secured, nicely moving out, going to even enjoy lunch at the lounges at the airport. This is really something that we've never seen before. But we really hope, Chair, that these 49 individuals can be declared undesirable persons and their citizenship revoked indefinitely, because their actions amount to them having denounced their citizenship. Chair, the EFF strongly believes that we should not depend on the US for trade. As it stands, the US is our second biggest trade partner. But in real terms, we should get the Minister of Trade and Industry to come to this committee, Chair, to explain the trade deals, including AGOA, that we have with the US, to explain to us who benefits more from the trade deals between the US and South Africa. It can be that we're not able to bring the Minister of Trade and Industry on an issue, on a burning issue that all South Africans are interested in knowing. What is our interest? Why do we then go all out to beg the US to continue trading with us? What is really our national interest in ensuring that we reset this relationship with the US? Now, as we navigate these turbulent relations with the US, let us bring all the cards to the table and check the biggest beneficiary from these trade deals between these two countries. We know that there are about 600 American businesses that are operating in South Africa that have turned us to become consumers of their products, including fruit products that we're consuming, or our people are consuming through their franchises, that some have questionable health standards. Perhaps we should also look at these American franchises that have brought, especially the food franchises that they've brought to South Africa. Are they not the cause that we're seeing our people lately experiencing or being obese? And we check the quality of the food that they serve in those franchises there. So the EFF proposes that we go to the global south to look for alternative markets and new trade partners. We should be looking to leverage on our participation in BRICS Plus. We should look into African Union and go to the African Union to implement the African Continental Free Trade Area in order to expand and solidify trades within African states, Chair. That should be what we're prioritizing. Further, we should be looking into building our own African Central Bank to help each other as African states to build our economies. So we are not...
Sorry, Honorable Mhlongo, please, I'm going to apologize for disrupting you. And Adam Tembo, are you still going to depart now, or...
Chair, I can stay and for another 15 minutes before I head out.
Okay. Proceed, Honorable Mhlongo, and I'll request that I don't know what we are going to do, but at least we must give Dr. Mthembu an opportunity to respond to one or two issues before he leaves. He says he's left with 15 minutes. Proceed, Honorable Mhlongo.
Thank you, Chair. So we must solidify our trade in Africa, Chair. We must look into Africa and solidify the African continental free trade area and ensure that it works and ensure that we are able to trade amongst ourselves and Africans, but also go to BRICS, go to the global south to ensure that we explore new trade partners, new markets for ourselves. And we must look into building a African Central Bank that will be tasked with ensuring that we have our own African currency that we'll use to trade with in order to build a strong African economy, a currency reflecting our richness or our wealth in mineral resource. As South Africa, we should really be championing through Pan-African Parliament to have one foreign policy in Africa to trade with the rest of the world on our own terms, so that our economy must not rely on the US dollar that gets to be manipulated to start trade wars and to influence internal domestic affairs of other countries. And Chair, we must remind President Ramaphosa that the Sixth Parliament took a resolution to cut all diplomatic ties with genocidal Israel. And then when he goes begging Trump, he should never cower and give in to demands to mend relationships with genocidal Israel. In fact, we are encouraging President Ramaphosa to take the opportunity in the US to tell Trump and his allies that the genocidal Israel were continuing our battle at the International Court of Justice to have genocide in Palestine declared a genocide caused by Benjamin Netanyahu and apartheid genocidal Israel. Even today, Chair, as the Minister of Finance delivers his budget vote, we really look forward to see if they will not be cutting off the allocation of funds to continue the battle in the ICJ. We will not take lightly should the funds to fight this battle of the people of Palestine at the ICJ be cut. We're not going to agree to that a measure. Chairperson, we really hope at this point that the Trump administration gets to listen to the voices of people of South Africa and listen especially to this Committee of International Relations on what we are putting on the table as these committee members. We must give our full support to DERCO and Minister Lamula to ensure also that the Taiwan liaison office in Pretoria relocates immediately as South Africa, as the South African government has done so, and in order to recognize the One China policy. And we must not cower because we're trying to mend relationships with Trump and he's saying that we're pushing away their allies, which is Taiwan and Israel, and then we cower because we want to mend relations. It shouldn't be like that, Chair. We should never compromise our principle in order to mend the relationship with the US. It should not happen. We must not give in. In fact, we must really take a note of what Trump has said, that he's perhaps considering not to come to attend the G20 summit in November when South Africa hands over the presidency to the US. Now, the real reason Trump is running away from the G20 chair is because he fears to face his peers at the global stage because of the erratic tariffs that he has imposed on many countries across the globe. And then we must really, Chair, plead and ensure that we get President Ramaphosa to reject the credence of one Mr. Pozelle, who is set to who has been nominated and set to become an ambassador of the US in South Africa. Mr. Pozelle should be really rejected because he's not a diplomat. He's a white supremacist who supports genocidal Israel and perpetuates violence and war on women, children, and the elderly, and ordinary citizens who want to have them wiped off the face of the earth by being born Palestinians. Pozelle should be rejected, Chair, from coming to South Africa and being an ambassador on behalf of the US, because we know his mandate is coming here to undermine and use the South African soil and the platform that will be given to him as an ambassador to undermine our revolutionary stance and correct stance when it comes to genocidal Israel. We note, Chair, the reports that we're receiving that our President Ramaphosa has opted to be a +1 of the real president of South Africa, Mr. Rupert, to take him to the US to try to mend the relationships. We're looking forward to the meeting that seeks to sit today between Rupert and Elon Musk, as well as their deployed presidents Ramaphosa and Trump. that is going to sit today. We're looking forward to see what is going to happen there. But we must say, Chair, that the inclusion of Rupert in a diplomatic delegation is a spit in the face of our democracy. Rupert is leading this charge. We know him as a major beneficiary of unequal land and economic relations in South Africa, and has in the past even threatened to disinvest in this country and collapse our economy if his ill-gotten wealth is threatened through constitutional mechanism. Now today he's leading, is there on a diplomatic delegation. Really, this is a cause for concern for us. We know that Rupert is there to save his business interest. And then we must tell President Ramaphosa, he must know that Trump has no intentions of listening to fact or reality as it relates to the transformation agenda in South Africa or the treatment of Afrikaner people. On 12 May, Trump made it clear that the sole intention of the visit by South Africa will be for our nation's leaders to account regarding a non-existent genocide of Afrikaners in our country. Yesterday, the U.S. Secretary of State, Mr. Marco Rubio, was questioned about the manufactured white genocide in South Africa by Senate members. And then he stood firm and continued the misinformation that they are peddling, even when presented with facts and shown the hypocrisy of the US government in dealing with real genocides that are happening in Sudan and Palestine. And America has opted to cut aid from those countries. They've opted that they would rather have people die in order to punish Africa for the interest of America, really, Chair. As soon as this delegation that is led by Rupert is back from the US, we need them to come to this committee, Chair, to account on what is it that they have promised Trump and Elon Musk, so that we're able to safeguard our democracy and our sovereignty. We can't have our country captured and controlled by the US as if we're some satellite state of the US that has no right, none whatsoever, to one self-govern or to self-determine. So Rupert must be told that as the EFF will not watch idly as he captures the state. Imagine the outcry that Rupert would have received by now if he was a Gupta. We are witnessing state capture 2.2, and like we have warned Zuma with the Guptas, Ramaphosa must know that EFF will not take lightly when our state is being captured by owners and of our economy, people who control this industry. A man like Rupert, who has made it clear that if his ill-gotten wealth is threatened or compromised, or if we expropriate land without compensation for equal redistribution, he will disinvest from a country. We are worried, teacher. We never, as South African voters, never voted for Rupert, Retief, Hussein, and Ellen else to go and represent them on diplomatic engagements with the US. So we must not take lightly what the US is doing. They are compromising our safety and our sovereignty as a country. So it shouldn't be taken lightly what they are doing. And then we try to massage their egos and please them by taking the owners of the economy, white Afrikaners, in the man of Johan Rupert, to go there and plead for our case. We should explore alternative market. This relationship of South Africa and US, it must not be treated as if it only benefits South Africa. It does not benefit South Africa. The US is benefiting. 600 of their companies are here in South Africa. When we are told that they are cutting aid, they want to cut diplomatic ties, we must remember they've got businesses here. We've got the right to also cut ties with them and perhaps nationalize their businesses that are here and ensure that we use those businesses to create jobs for our people. We go and look for alternative markets. We can't be threatened as if we're the ones who are only benefiting from this relationship. Why not, Chair? It can't be true that we're the only people benefiting. Obviously, we'll have the likes of the DA because they will come here and say, no, AGOA has created these jobs and whatnot. But who are the real beneficiaries? Who's owning Ford? Ford is an American company. Yes, they've got a factory in South Africa. Yes, they've created jobs for South Africans. But who owns it? It's the Americans. They come here and bring their product. Who owns the big franchises? Like your McDonald's and Burger King. It's Americans, it's American companies that are brought here and underpaying our people, overworking our people, paying them slavery wages. So it cannot be that it looks like South Africa it must be the only one that seeks to save this relationship with the US. The US is benefiting from us. Their economy was built on the back of our people. They took slaves in Africa. They came here to loot our mineral and natural resources to go and build their industry. And then they come here and want to bulldoze us. We must never be bulldozed, Chair. We hope Mr. Ramaphosa there, as he's being led by Johan Rupert, he will not cower and give in to demands. Chair, as soon as they are back, please, we need to reorganize this meeting of this nature, Chair, and come and get the Minister of International Relations, even if it's a joint sitting with trade and industry, to come and account what is it that they promised Donald Trump and Elon Musk. We need to be presented with the deals that will be signed there so that we read between the lines. We don't have our sovereignty compromised because there's some relation that must be saved with the US, Chair. We really hope you take this proposal we're making, that we need accountability on this trip that has been taken today, and watch with interest if Ramaphosa will not be ridiculed like what they've done to Zelensky when he went to embarrass himself in the US. Imagine when we've got our president embarrassed the way they embarrassed Zelensky there. We hope we don't get to be embarrassed because the real president, Mr. Rupert, is there leading the delegation. Perhaps the dignity of Mr. Ramaphosa will be preserved because there's white Afrikaner males who have surrounded him and made sure that they take charge and lead the delegation of South Africa. So, Chair, we must be disgusted that we've got non-elected people who are not members of South Africa, who are not members of government or elected officials or officials of the state who are leading a diplomatic delegation. Is what we condemned when Trump was leading this charge against South Africa. That is an unelected government official. We've got no right. We condemned even Cyril Ramaphosa when we make contact with Elon Musk trying to save the relationship of South Africa with the US. That it's not done. It's breaking all the diplomatic ties. We've got no relation. We've got no business with Elon Musk. He's just a billionaire that we've got no business with as the state. So it can't be that when we have condemned such, then we've got Ramaphosa going along with other billionaires of South Africa to go and lead a diplomatic delegation. Is wrong, Chair. It must be called out for what it is. And moving on, we need Minister Lamula to come to this committee as we are discussing each and every topic at hand. We can't have think tanks alone. We need the minister. If he's not available, the deputy minister. Most of our committees, Chair, we hold them virtually. So anyone can join anywhere they find themselves in. It's not an excuse that they are not available. Where is the deputy minister? Why is not here as we're discussing this important matter? As you can see, that is Mr. Ramaphosa is going to meet with the US today. So let's just end it here for now, Chair, on our side. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Honorable Mhlongo. It has been brought to my attention that we've got on the platform Ambassador Xolisa Mabongo, who is the DDG in DERCO. We also have Ambassador Dlomo, who is also on the platform. I'm sorry, I was not aware that you are on the platform. I didn't acknowledge your presence, but we did acknowledge the presence of DERCO in the meeting. So I hope that clarifies one of the issues raised, that there's no DERCO in the meeting. Just before I give Dr. Pilar, Honorable Mhlongo, there are just two things. The first one is the presidency did confirm in writing to the people of South Africa on who is accompanying the president to the meeting with the US president. And that delegation is well known, the ministers who are there. So until the presidency confirms these other names like Rupert and so on, for now, I think we must confine ourselves to the official correspondence from the presidency. That's number one. Number two, its consistency, honorable members, in referring to the president as president of the Republic, President Ramaphosa. Because Honorable Mhlongo, sometimes she will say President Ramaphosa, sometimes she will say Ramaphosa. So I'm just urging that in line with the rules of Parliament, we consistently refer to each other as honorable members and then Honorable President of the Republic. I Our next speaker is, okay, before we go there, Ndatem Tembu, do you want to say anything before you depart?
Chair, thank you.
Overlapped into your 15 minutes.
No, thank you, Chair. I'll be brief. My colleagues are still on the call, so they'll be able to engage with other questions. Sanusha is there, but also another colleague of ours, Arina Morrison, is also on the call. What I wanted to note, Chair, is that what is important is that indeed, I think when business leaders sort of make their decisions, at times they have to understand, obviously, that at times they are not able to, they don't have the luxury, let's say, to wait on members of the US Congress. So for many years, it has been quite clear that there was pressure from Congress for South Africa to not be a beneficiary of the African Growth and Opportunity Act. However, what's important with the AGOA is that AGOA isn't a trade agreement. It's an initiative, a one-sided initiative from the US, and so annually the US essentially would get to decide who is a beneficiary and who is not a beneficiary. Now, that may have at a certain time, benefited South Africa. But if you think about it, I mean, over the long term, it's not a stable agreement to essentially for long-term planning, especially for a major African economy such as South Africa, engaging with a major industrialized economy in the form of the US. And so there definitely is an opportunity there for a reciprocal trade agreement that benefits South Africa, but that, of course, will also be mutually beneficial for the US. I mean, just to highlight this point, if we think about it, that in essentially the South Africa being a sort of key destination, right, of US FDI. Yes, South Africa is home to about 600 US companies. They employ roughly 148,000 people. Yes, in terms of US investment in South Africa, I think in 2022, it was around 7.4 billion. Yes, we have major corporations like General Electric. We've got, Ford, who have a strong presence in South Africa. But it's also important to note that we also have South African companies operating in the US who are also employing thousands of US workers. Some of those figures indicate 7,000 figures. Some of them indicate more. However, the number is actually more because also in terms of the trade that the US does, but also in terms of the FDI that the US does. Some of the figures push those numbers in terms of US jobs up to close to 50,000 that the US actually, that the US is able to maintain that number of jobs through investment and trade ties with South Africa. So this is truly a mutually beneficial relationship. In terms of the oversight, of course, it does become important to disaggregate in terms of the beneficiaries of economic relations between South Africa and the US, and try to ensure that in line with also South Africa's constitutional imperatives, is that you also create opportunities for small and medium enterprises to also benefit, whether through the broader value chain in terms of South Africa trade relations, but to ensure that we have certainly more South Africans obviously benefiting from this relationship. We also know that, the US is a major source of tourists for South Africa, and that the numbers in recent years spiked by 40%. when it comes to US tourism. We also have a number of students in the US, but we also have a number of US students in South African academic institutions, whether teaching or also as students. And just in on AGOA, just to highlight the fact that South Africa has, over the last 30 odd years, sought to diversify its economic relations, in a sense that if we look, for instance, at in 2000, when AGOA went into effect, South Africa increased its automotive exports to the US from $195 million in 2000 to 1.8 billion in 2013. In 2000, South Africa exported, I think, a total of about 2.2 billion in automotive exports, and 8.7% of it went to the US. By 2013, South Africa was exporting 8.9 billion of automotives and sent about 20% to the US. So this was a big expansion, let's say, from the year 2000 to 2013. So about 2013, about 20% of our automotive exports were going into the US, and that's a significant amount. But over time, just to highlight that there has been a gradual diversification. Over time, for instance, in 2013, motor vehicles accounted for 25% of South Africa's exports to the US. However, by 2022, this figure had diminished to approximately 10%. Now, one may ask what happened, in that period from 2013 to 2022. Firstly, 2013, 25% are going into the US. 2022, 10% are going into the US. That is a result of diversification. South Africa now directs almost 2/3 of its automotive exports to the European Union. And recently, the EU had a summit with South Africa to consolidate some of those trade relations. So there has been a gradual diversification, and Africa has become a much more important market also, especially in terms of manufactured goods. For the first time in recent years, South Africa is exporting more manufactured products into Africa than they are even exporting into the European Union. And this is something that is certainly to be welcomed. And of course, the continued diversification of trade relations becomes quite important. This does not mean that South Africa, sort of takes a position to say it does not need the US. I mean, we know that there are towns like Citrusdal who rely significantly, disproportionately, on access to the US market. We know that some of our producers of nuts, producers of grapes, for instance, and wines, the US remains a significant market. And I think in that sense, diversifying our trade relations is not necessarily, it cannot necessarily be equated to, let's say, a complete shutdown of another market in that sense. So it is in South Africa's interest to remain sort of non-aligned, to remain open to trading with all countries that are open to accepting South African products and services, and that that includes the US. But at the same time, I don't think when negotiating, certainly you can negotiate on trade issues and so forth, but the delegation that is in the US, I don't think would necessarily look at issues like the case in the ICJ as something that is negotiable, both procedurally but also on a matter of principle. So, countries do not necessarily negotiate their national interests. Their national interests remain relatively stable. Their principles remain relatively stable. However, there is room to negotiate when it comes to issues of trade, when it comes to issues of investment, not just about US companies expanding their exports or their investments in South Africa, but also South African companies expanding their own access into the US market while continuing to expand their exports into China, into Africa, and into other global markets. So I think that is something that is, quite important. I think it's also important to note that a loss of AGOA, it does not necessarily only have negative impacts on South Africa. It also has negative impacts on the US. So for instance, some models indicate that a loss of AGOA could have ramifications for the US, as the US relies on South Africa for a range of critical minerals. We've mentioned 100% of its chromium comes from South Africa, as well as over 25% of its manganese, titanium, and platinum. So South Africa is not going into, the US empty-handed. Part of the reason why, President Ramaphosa and his delegation are the first African delegation into the US on a state visit is because of the significance of not only South Africa, but the significance of the Southern African Customs Union countries to the US, both as an export market, but also as trading partners. We are the largest trade partners of the US in sub-Saharan Africa, in Africa in general. So we are essentially very important to the US. So at times it is important. I mean, I think Sanusha mentioned, sort of strategic patience and all that. Sometimes it's important, at least for decision makers, to cancel out the noise from the substance, and to understand that, in as much as our own exporters into the US market want that market to remain open, but the US itself and US business interests are also putting pressure on the Trump administration to not escalate things with South Africa to the point that it also hurts their economic interests. So our team in the US is not going there sort of, to beg, or our team is not necessarily being summoned into the US. South Africa is a significant player in Africa, in the global South, and in the global economy because of its geostrategic position, because of its capabilities and so forth. And so it's not by accident, that we are the first African delegation that is having this meeting at the White House, because outside of the noise and the disinformation, US interests understand that they could also be hurt by a further escalation of the relationship. So it's not a one-way stream. I think our delegation has cards to play, and I would hope that indeed those cards are played in a mutually respectful manner. But they are certainly, at least in terms of our assessment of the relationship, this is not this is a mutually beneficial relationship. It's not about, sort of South Africa being summoned there and so forth. There is a mutual understanding of the importance of this relationship outside of the noise that sometimes comes, through social media and through some of these disinformation campaigns. So I'll leave it there, Chair, and then my colleagues will take the discussion further. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Mtembu, and we wish you luck to where you are going to do the presentation. Thank you very much. Honorable members, it's now 20 to 11. We have 4 speakers. And to be fair, because Honorable Mhlongo spoke for 20 minutes, we will have, that should be the minutes we allocate to members. There is another hand again. Honorable Sally, I see you have lowered your hand. Are you okay now?
Thank you, Honorable Chair. I just need to place things on record. I have listened to.
Just before you speak.
Good morning, everybody. Good morning, Honorable Chair. Can you hear me?
No, just before you speak, because your hand was up and then it was lower. So I wanted to know if you are still going to speak or not.
Look, a lot of what I've been is, I don't know if they're going to be able to cover me, because I just feel that the minister should be on the platform, or the deputy minister, etc.
Maybe we don't hear each other. I'm trying to work on time. Right? We've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 speakers if you are going to speak. So that's why I wanted to confirm.
Yes, I am going to speak, Honorable Chair.
So it means we have 5 speakers.
Yes, I do know we're short on time. I don't know if that's going to also
The
impact.
last bus, honorable members, leaves at 12:30 from the villages. And notice has been sent out that the last bus leaves at 12:30. So I hope members of the public can understand. There are some who refer to us as fat cats who have it nice here in Parliament. If you miss the bus, you have missed it. It's like living in a village where I grew up. There's one bus, and if it's gone, it's gone. Over to you, Honorable Sally.
Thank you, Honorable Chair. Good morning to all the honorable members and to all on the platform. I think this is obviously a very serious conversation that impacts on all of us in many ways. We've got a relationship between South Africa and the US. We have many South Africans living in the US and vice versa. And obviously there is our people that is working in the different areas, as well as tourism. So we are all in this situation together at this particular stage, and we are all navigating waters globally right now that we never thought we would see ourselves in. The history of the relationship between South Africa and US, the pushback, is evident, as is the history that South Africa does not give into bullying, victimization, dictatorship of US and any other country or oppressor. Considering the history of South Africa under colonizers and apartheid, let us not forget the US history, which also has deep roots in colonization and apartheid of their own. The history of pushback and pull is before Trump right now, but it is correct, as noted by our previous speakers, that this situation comes from a long period of time. It doesn't just come under Trump's administration, but I don't think we have ever in the history seen the form of erratic behavior under an administration as we are currently seeing under Trump. The blatant actions and support of arming a genocide in Gaza by the US and the relationship with the unlawful barbaric state of Israel does not go unnoticed. The arming of the genocide, the bragging of assistance in displacing Palestinians, the murder and stealing of land unashamedly, the denial of aid, and deliberate starving. And then we also find Trump hopping from country to country, seeking trillions of dollars, and sadly so, from entities like Saudi Arabia. US cannot be trusted, nor can its allies. Why is it that the oppressor and still forms part of the oppression right here in South Africa? Yes, our landscape is changing, and it is a threat to America's supremacy attitude. The ICJ case exposed not just Israel, but its allies, including political parties who are complicit in crimes against humanity, and hence the attempt at shutting down the ICJ case. Today, we're also going to continue with regard to the budget, and I hope there's no cut on the budget with regard to the particular ICJ case. Because right in South Africa, we witness a push and pull attempt of dictatorship and supporting those oppressors who is committing genocide in Palestine. And also, those same entities are the ones responsible for what we see in the DRC, in Kashmir, and many other areas. AfriForum, parties such as DA creating their own international relationships does not assist South Africa. The opportunistic alleged refugees who are settled in America are an embarrassment upon South Africa and are currently used to spread a narrative. That narrative is also being spread by the Trump administration. But I'm sure by now they have realized what fools they are in having taken these individuals in. I'm in agreement with previous speakers that the Minister of Trade should actually be on this platform, the Minister of International Relations and our Deputy Minister, to explain to us the visit of President Ramaphosa currently in America. Because this is our president who has also indicated that we will not be victimized, nor will we be bullied. And we have noted also the disrespect by sending lower officials into South Africa surrounding the G20. And Honorable Chair, there is a deliberate attempt at jeopardizing the G20 in South Africa. And this is something that we also need to be very, very alert to. South Africa needs to look at alternative relationships and maintain an independence from the US. Yes, there is a form of interrelationship between South Africa and the US, but we are not dependent entirely on the US. We comprehend this mutual relationship and it's not one-sided. We should encourage tourism. I know the tourism to America, but we should start really encouraging tourism to the countries that has moved closer to South Africa and who are our true allies and are truly of assistance to South Africa, countries such as China. The sad reality is we cannot ignore the disrespect of the US currently surrounding South Africa, and we can understand that maybe our honorable president currently he's in US in order to change certain perceptions that has been created by people like AfriForum, as well as the DA and others who has visited America. That could be understood in order to, provide the truth of the matter within South Africa. But is there going to be any benefit with regard to this particular visit is another story. But thank you, Honorable Chair, and I thank the speakers for their presentation. And I note the request for the megaphone to be a bit silent, but I don't think us as South Africans will ever be silent when we see a wrong being committed. And I thank you.
Okay, sorry, I didn't mute honorable members. Thank you very much, Honorable Sally. Honorable Douglas.
Good morning, Mr. Chair, and good morning to the members. Thank you very much.
Honorable Douglas, you are frozen.
Let us
You are
set
frozen.
the record. Am I frozen? Can you hear me now?
Slightly, yes.
Okay, how does that sound?
Proceed, let's see.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Chair. Before I begin, I would just really want to set the record straight with the advent of these 59 South Africans coming to South Africa, going from South Africa to America as refugees. It's a blatant slap in the face of the South African local population, of the indigenous African people and of the Khoisan San indigenous people. The only true victims of genocide in this land are the Khoisan San, Mr. Chair, and the native Aboriginal and native African indigenous peoples. And the perpetrators of those genocides against us are now crying victimhood in Washington and clutching Trump's hand as refugees. These are the white Afrikaners and British descendants. They are not the people that are the victims, they are the perpetrators. Afrikaners are not the hunted, they are the hunters. They are not dispossessed, they are dispossessors. They are not oppressed. They are the descendants of conquerors, slavers, land thieves, and mass murderers, protected for decades by apartheid laws, and now shielded by a constitution they helped design to keep their stolen land, which they stole from us and our forefathers, by acts of violence. Afrikaner settlers hunted Khoi and San people as vermin until 1957, using government-issued permits under the so-called Vermin Act, issued by an Afrikaner government. They cut our heads off, put it in bags, and that's how they claimed the land. And they cut our women's breasts off after raping them and used them for tobacco bags. These are what they so-called refugees have done to us for generations. They ordered and introduced biological warfare through the deliberate spread of smallpox to wipe out indigenous populations. They cleared out our ancestral lands, which is now their wine farms, $1 million wine farms, their $1 million beach homes, and their $1 million wine estates, through murder, through rape, through forced removals, and spiritual desecration of the First Nation Aboriginal Khoi and San people, who still live here in the same concentration camps that the Afrikaner apartheid government put us in. So there mustn't be a confusion about who the perpetrators are. These Afrikaners are not the victims. There's only been one Afrikaner killing, only one farm murder in 2024. Does that constitute a genocide? No. They refused to allow the Khoi and San to be recognized alongside other African tribes in the post-apartheid era, deliberately silencing other historical presence to hold onto our land and violate international laws like the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People and the ILO Convention 169. And now the same people who presided over 400 years of genocide, who have the audacity now to come and claim they are victims. No, this is nonsense, Mr. Chair. As President Ramaphosa meets with President Trump today, we are witnessing the export of a manufactured crisis, a geopolitical tool wrapped in false sympathy and used to destabilize our sovereignty. Trump's springtime refugee program for white South Africans is not based in reality. It is based on the propaganda of AfriForum, Solidarity, and the Democratic Alliance. The Agricultural Minister, John Steenhuisen, is not his first trip there. He's been to those places and he's been telling them nonsense about what's happening and about land reform. They know they stole the land. They know they killed our people. They massacred our people and hunted us until 1938, 37 with permits. And yet they now go and claim that they are the ones that are under the threat. This is the same America that claimed Saddam Hussein had weapons of mass destruction, launched an illegal war in Iraq, killed 10 million people, and simply said, oops, we lied, sorry. We must expose this playbook. The United States is again lying to the world to justify intervention in our sovereignty as a pretext for diplomatic, economic, and perhaps even military intervention and persecution against a sovereign African nation based on false lies and false narratives. Let us set the record straight here today. In 2024, like I said, there was only one white farmer killed. In the same year, 2024, over 2,500 young colored and black males were slaughtered in the Cape Flats, armed by the SAPS and by government, left to die in gangster war zones designed by apartheid planners and preserved by post-apartheid elites. Yet these murders of the poor and non-white majority Christians, South Africans, do not make it to Fox News. There is no asylum for a colored or a Christian or Muslim mother and her children in Lavender Hill and other gang and drug infested unsafe communities suffering under the ANC and GNU's uncaring government who maintains gangsterism instead of solving its problems. Why can we, as the Khoi and San, not claim asylum in America, whereas our perpetrators can, the racists who are the perpetrators of apartheid and are still benefited from the land till today? They are crying and running away because justice is coming, because righteousness is coming, because they fear justice. This isn't about safety, this is about justice. So the Afrikaners are not fleeing persecution, they are fleeing accountability. They, the Afrikaners and British descendants, are running to America to intervene in our sovereign land reform processes because they are protecting their greed and hoarding and racist apartheid and colonial stolen land and the stolen minerals. And they now want to steal all our oil deposits and gas deposits we just discovered to get richer and fatter while the people suffer in poverty in the world's richest mineral wealth countries. Our oil reserves alone can be used by a caring government to free all South Africans from poverty and economic uncertainty, but they still choose under the GNU instead to keep hoarding it. And even the 59 that ran as refugees to America went clutching stolen mine ownership papers and farm ownership documents with them so they can keep looting, keep leeching off South Africa, even while they blackmail us as refugees in the USA. These Afrikaners and those that live here with us are the perpetrators and thieves and murderers trying to use America's media might to whitewash their evil and delay justice for the poor Aboriginal and Indigenous rightful owners of this land. And they are therefore the main cause of all our land and social economic problems to this day, and they must be held accountable, and MK will hold them accountable. Let me remind you, Mr. Chair, we are the oldest First Nation people in the world, the Khoi and the San. We ran a thriving port and trade route in Cape Town long before Jan van Riebeeck's arrival, trading gold, water, food, meat, large domesticated animals. We were the biggest, most powerful trading nation in the world when Jan van Riebeeck then came here. We weren't just herders, and we weren't just the San. There's the Khoi and then there's the San. As the Khoi, we had a nation, we had a standing military, we had kings, we had armies. So we were dispossessed, not by accident, but by design. The real genocide is the legalized hunting, killing, and attempted erasure of the rights of the South African Aboriginal and Indigenous people. And while Afrikaners live on these stolen farms, we live in backyards, in shacks, in silence. Our kings and our queens are not recognized. Our languages are dying. Our ancestral sites are now golf courses, luxury lodges, and wine estates. This is economic genocide, spiritual erasure, and political exclusion. That is why the Contextualizing has launched the country's first ever private members bill for the recognition of the Khoi and San as a First Nation people in this country, as well as the African Indigenous people. And we will claim our priorities and we'll claim our rights under UNDRIP, which we signed in 2007. The Afrikaners are running because they know what they have done. They are running because they see the wave of Indigenous awakening, youth mobilization, and Pan-African unity rising in support of MKP, a true liberation movement and the only true voice of the people. They are running because we are demanding justice, not just for apartheid, but for colonial conquest, and we're demanding restorative justice, restitution, and our land and mineral rights back, as is our international right. We demand the full recognition of the Khoi and San First Nation peoples. We need the return of ancestral land for Khoi and San and African Indigenous peoples. We want the nullification of apartheid-era land titles granted under forced removals. We want reparations for 400 years of extermination and exploitation. And we want the restoration of our traditional leaders, councils with legislative power and land custodianship. The changing of the world's most corrupt and anti-Aboriginal and anti-Indigenous constitution, especially Section 25 and the 1913 limit for claims, has to be done. We are already protected under the United Nations Declaration of Rights of Indigenous People, and the ANC and the GNU is in violation of these laws, and we will take that matter to the ICJ if this is not corrected by MK. This state has violated this international law since 2017. The US under Trump has ideology, and his ideological MAGA movement is not just falsely accusing us. They're not acting in diplomatic good faith. They know the truth, and yet they are espousing lies. They're supposed to be a Christian nation. How can they lie like this and perpetuate the lie? It is not protecting refugees. It's enabling white supremacists to regroup and evade justice. What is their true agenda? Their true agenda, as can be seen by the meetings by Johan Rupert and by Elon Musk and the business community, the Stellenbosch mafia that is the true owners of this land, the true rulers of this land. It's not Ramaphosa. Ramaphosa is not taking them. They're taking Ramaphosa to the president because they want to secure access to South Africa's rare earth minerals, lithium, vanadium, cobalt, and platinum. We own 85% of the world's rare earth minerals, and not the rare earth minerals, of the world's platinum minerals groups. They're trying to derail BRICS, break multipolar unity, and reimpose dollar head homogeny. To use false claims of genocide, justify future trade sanctions, asset seizures, and even military threats. That is an ungodly and unjust narrative. They want our land, they want our minerals, but they do not want our people to live with dignity and for that minerals to go to free our people from poverty. We will not accept any more of these lies as MKP. We will tell the truth and the history of our people, which has been denied and erased, so that these colonists that come from Europe can say that this is their land. This is not their land. They decided to take our land by force, by killing our people, by apartheid laws. They include Areas Act of 1950. They just moved us from our lands, from our farms, from the beaches, from the beautiful places we stayed. They took us and they chucked us into concentration camps, and they left us there just to be cheap labor for them. And we will not stand for that. Just to be clear, we are not anti-white. We are anti-colonial. We are not anti-American. We are anti-imperialism. You know, I used to respect this guy, Jordan Peterson. I saw him on YouTube until he gave a global stage to Dr. Ernest Roots, a discredited apartheid apologist, ideological protagonist, and a mouthpiece for AfriForum's white nationalist revisionism. In doing so, Peterson betrayed his own intellectual legacy, choosing racist mythology over academic integrity. You know, I just want to say, Mr. Chair, this is completely a whitewash and hack job that they're trying to do through American media and American social media. When you look at the Secretary of State, Marco Rubio, in his support for this narrative, has shown himself to be an ideological descendant of apartheid's foreign backers. He has no right to speak on South African history, even when he cannot even acknowledge America's own crimes, from the slaughter of the Native Americans and the refusal to return the land to them and give them what is rightfully theirs, and the genocide against them, to the genocide and slaughter of innocents in Iraq and in Gaza. They claim a false genocide here in South Africa, but they're blind to the real genocide in Gaza. How hypocritical is that? And that's completely unchristian. When you look at the inclusion of Jan Rupert and other Stellenbosch mafia and their talks with Elon Musk and other South African linked business people, it shows their motives only to keep South Africa white monopoly, power over our lands and over our resources. Their presence in these meetings undermines our sovereignty, makes it clear who owns and runs South Africa, and they are doing deals behind closed doors under President Ramaphosa's watch, while our people are enslaved further, dispossessed once again, and our own resources and Aboriginal and individual indigenous Africans once again is being stolen from under us in quiet meetings in Washington. This delegation of private landowners and mine owners shows who really is represented by the president, the GNU, and the ANC. They are the puppets of the West. This is another attempted coup of our oil and rare earth minerals and commodities, an attempted hijacking of our sovereign telecommunications through Starlink without any BEE empowerment. These are the faces of our oppressors, white Afrikaner landowners who still hold on to stolen land at the expense of the people. And they are trying to pull us away from the global South and BRICS and enslave us through debt and white genocide lies to the USA and the Western world. As MKP, we will undo all of this in 2029 when we take over national government. The Ruperts and white minority capital do not speak for us. They speak for themselves and the business and political GNU elite. And any deals they sign on Aboriginal and Indigenous land will be declared null and void under the Cohen Sun Recognition Bill and under an MKP government in 2029. Let the Americans also be warned, we are non-aligned and we have hundreds of USA companies making money in our markets, and you depend on our ports and trade routes around the tip of Africa, and your technology depends on our rare earth minerals, and we own 87% of the world's platinum group minerals. Sanctions, tariffs, and exclusion can go both ways. If the USA wants to threaten us and cut us out of AGOA, we will reciprocate and we will cut USA off all our markets and our economy, and they will never touch our mineral oil and oil wealth if they continue to spread lies and falsehoods about white genocide and receiving racist refugees. Under MKP, we will summons America and President Trump here to account for his lives, not for us to go there and plead with a hand in our cap. Because we have the authority, we are from Africa, this is our land and this is our resources. In closing, Mr. Chair, I just want to say we've had enough of the lies. Can people just not speak the truth? And we as MK, we've been standing up for the people. We are saying the resources belong to the people who are originally from this land, the Aboriginal people, Indigenous people, Black, Colored, Khoisan people, all our people deserve to share in the wealth of this land. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thanks, Honorable Douglas. Honorable Powell.
Thanks, Chairperson. Chair, I just want to ask you, please, we haven't had the Minister come and talk or account to or before this committee, I think in over a year. So I would like to request via the Secretary's office that a hearing or a committee meeting be scheduled with the Minister so that he can come and brief us, particularly on the outcomes of these meetings in Washington, D.C., but also more broadly about some of his engagements in the world. I think that's critical. Our job here in Parliament is to hold the Minister and the Department accountable, and it's not possible for us to do that if the Minister doesn't ever attend our committee. So if we could please find a slot for that. Chair, in regards to the subject at hand, it's clear that the diplomatic relationship between the United States and South Africa has been deteriorating over a number of years, and this deterioration didn't begin with the 47th president of the US, Donald Trump. It began a number of years ago. You will recall in May of 2023, Ambassador Ruben Brigatti's explosive Lady R allegations that were then followed by the bipartisan, so Democrats and Republicans, approving the markup of the US-South Africa Bilateral Relations Review Act last year through the House Foreign Affairs Committee. These were, of course, the first signals that the relationship was in distress and that South Africa's continued eligibility under AGOA was no longer guaranteed. For 2 years, the US at various levels, via the embassy, via Congress, via the State Department, warned at that point the ANC-led government that it was flying too close to the wind and that actions would ultimately have consequences. Yet, in absence of any tangible attempt by either the presidency or DIRCO to rebuild trust, South Africa remained on a collision course with its most significant trade, foreign direct investment and development partner. And so into this vacuum, the Democratic Alliance stepped. And this was to protect our national interests and our economic growth prospects. And so over the last 2 years, we've led 4 high-level outreach missions to Washington, D.C. to engage with the National Security Council, congressional leaders, the State Department, think tanks, and business leaders. And our message has been clear that we support strong, principled, and mutually beneficial partnerships with our allies, including the United States, that are anchored in shared democratic values and a commitment to a rules-based international order. And thanks to this proactive engagement, the party that I represent now enjoys considerable goodwill in Washington, where US policymakers understand that we are a party that's committed to the rule of law, to constitutional democracy, and to pro-market reforms, and that now as a partner in government, we will hold the line within the GNU. But goodwill towards the party that I represent as a coalition partner isn't enough to now mend what the ANC has broken over many, many decades. Pretoria's downgrade of the Taipei liaison office, its decision to litigate against Israel at the International Criminal Court, whilst over 57,000 of our own citizens are killed each year, public support for BRICS de-dollarization narratives, ongoing equivocation on Putin's war of aggression in Ukraine, which is a violation of international law, deepening ties with the theocratic dictatorship of Iran, which of course denies even basic rights to over half of its population on the basis of gender. And then of course, hobnobbing with regional despots in Mozambique and Zimbabwe have revealed a foreign policy that is still driven by the ANC's liberation era allegiances rather than South Africa's national interest or strategic priorities. And of course, South Africa must act in its national interest, but right now, all of us need to admit that that national interest must be creating growth, jobs, and lifting the poorest South Africans, regardless of their race, out of poverty. South Africa's ideological drift away from building strong ties with our democratic allies who espouse constitutional values carries real costs, not just diplomatically, but economically. Now, we know that democracies, as shown by extensive data from World Values Survey, the World Bank, and Freedom House, are consistently more prosperous than authoritarian states. Because democracies protect private property rights, they ensure transparency, they uphold civil and individual freedom and liberties, and they encourage innovation through freedom of expression and through open markets. And we know as an empirical fact that countries with strong democratic institutions are more likely to invest in public services such as education, healthcare, and infrastructure. They build a productive workforce and they build a resilient middle class. And the evidence is overwhelming, Chairperson. Democratic, free nations outperform authoritarian regimes in GDP per capita, human development, and in social cohesion. Let's look at some of the examples. In Northern Europe, long-standing democracies like Sweden, Germany, and the Netherlands boast high domestic growth, strong public services, and very low levels of corruption. In Asia, countries like Japan and South Korea rose from post-war poverty to become global economic powerhouses on the back of democratic governance and open markets. By contrast, if we look at autocracies like Cuba, Russia, Zimbabwe, and Iran, we see that their resource wealth has been squandered, their people live in poverty, growth has been stifled, and their populations are impoverished by repression and mismanagement. Cuba remains economically stagnant under centralized state control. Russia, despite, I might add, its vast energy reserves, is hobbled by oligarchy, corruption, war, and state capture. Zimbabwe's economy has collapsed under authoritarianism, farm seizures, farm murders, and rigged elections. And Iran, which is rich in oil, is now internationally isolated due to its human rights abuses, its ideological extremism, its religious fanaticism, and the basic fact that more than half of its population is systemically oppressed and denied the right to participate in public life, to work, to drive, to travel, and to participate in any decision-making processes on the basis of gender. So these cases prove a simple truth, that democracy and a commitment to democratic process creates the conditions for growth, for investor confidence, and for long-term prosperity. Now, warnings from Washington that South Africa was straying from its commitment to our long espoused and cherished constitutional ideals have finally given way to real consequences following the president's return to the White House. In rapid succession, we've seen life-saving PEPFAR funding terminated, US aid programs suspended, punitive tariffs have been imposed, and all US participation in G20 forums hosted by South Africa has been frozen. Now, we must be honest, of course, and acknowledge that these aid cuts are not unique to South Africa. But President Trump's executive orders citing land seizures, targeted racial discrimination, and so-called genocidal farm attacks has a very real consequence for our markets. Because we saw when these executive orders came out that our markets went into free fall and South Africa was left reeling. Now, under Trump's America First trade policy, which explicitly links trade to national security, through a raft of executive orders, his government made it clear that it will not continue to extend trade benefits or preferential trade terms to partners who actively align with the United States and the international community of democracies' strategic rivals, countries such as those that I've listed. And this should alarm us, because in 2024, last year, South Africa exported 157 billion rand worth of goods to the United States, and 76 billion rand of that was through AGOA. And if we contrast this to some of the nations that we've seen in recent years, our foreign ministry and government cozying up to, our exports to Russia totaled just 5.4 billion, and to Iran, only 350 million. So there can be no ambiguity from an economic perspective about which partnership matters more. And it's not about picking winners and losers. It's about aligning with nations that will help South Africa grow and lift our people out of poverty. Because AGOA provides duty-free access to over 6,000 products and it sustains key sectors such as automotive manufacturing, agriculture, mining, and jewelry. And more than 60% of all exports under AGOA are in fact value-added manufactured goods. Now, the presenter spoke to the supply chains that exist around the automotive sector, and that we now have very strong cooperative and trade agreements with many European nations in regards to automotive exports. But let's be clear, those supply chains exist in South Africa because of the markets that have emerged and been established here because of the preferential terms that AGOA has engendered in South Africa. So if we lose that market access in the United States, those incentives for those automotive manufacturers to situate their manufacturing plants here no longer exist, and they will then have a knock-on effect, compromising a lot of our exports to other nations. And the 600 companies that operate in South Africa, we can't take these for granted because they create jobs for poor South Africans. And if we look at that in the context of the latest unemployment figures, I think now more than 43% of all South Africans are unemployed, and that rate sits at more than 70% of all youth in this country do not have jobs. From an aid perspective, the US has also been one of our most reliable development partners. Last year, $453 million was allocated to HIV and AIDS treatment through PEPFAR. And before it was cut, $440 million had been allocated for this year. And this underpins life-saving HIV/AIDS services. And other sectors such as environmental protections, anti-illicit wildlife trafficking operations, and so on. And sadly, when PEPFAR was cut, the health ministry said that they were working to put together a plan, but to date, no plan has been tabled to plug the gaps, and we're now seeing clinics shuttering across South Africa. This impacts the poorest, most vulnerable South Africans. So given our stagnating economy, our ballooning debt, our record unemployment, and the World Bank and the IMF now having again reduced our projected growth outlook downwards from 1.6 to 1%, we really need, as a nation and as a portfolio committee, to be focusing on strategies and policies and aligning our engagements with nations that help South Africa to grow and to develop. And so today, the stakes in Washington really couldn't be higher, because at the core of the president's meetings in the United States is the South African jobs and growth agenda. So we have to ask ourselves, do we want to continue to bang the hackneyed drums of neocolonialism and imperialism, or do we want to grow our economy and lift South Africans out of poverty? So when the Honorable President Ramaphosa meets with President Trump today, our suggestions is that our president must begin with acknowledging that denying some of the accusations that are coming out of the US isn't a strategy, regardless of our personal feelings on some of the things that have been said about the nation that we love, and to also acknowledge that actions have consequences. Our president must give an unequivocal assurance that South Africa values its partnership with the US and is committed to repairing the relationship. And so this means that President Ramaphosa must today present a series of reform-oriented policy proposals in looking towards striking a deal that demonstrate that South Africa is willing to protect private property rights, which is, of course, a cornerstone of any functioning democracy, that we will uphold the rule of law, that we will reverse race-based policies that have only empowered a very small middle class and move towards using poverty as an indicator for disadvantage instead of narrow race categories, and to commit to market-friendly policies.
So, Honorable Powell, somebody saying Chairperson, is it Honorable?
It's Honorable Mshongo. Yes, Chair. Chair, I'd like to ask the Honorable Member a question. What are race-based laws in South Africa?
Sorry, Honorable.
If she can just mention what are those?
No, Honorable Mshongo. The approach is that we allow members, like you did, to speak freely until you are
I'm not
done.
stopping the member from speaking, Chair. I'm simply asking Honorable Powell, what are the race-based laws? She's making an insinuation that in South Africa there are race-based laws that favor certain people and does not favor, that must be reversed. So it's of interest that we know which laws are those.
Yeah, let her complete. Let her complete. Continue and complete.
Yeah, but when she's done, Chair, she must give us the example of those race-based laws that she honestly feels that they must be reversed, because it's not true that there are any race-based laws in South Africa.
Okay, proceed, Honorable Powell.
Thanks, Chairperson. I'll answer the question. Just one example would be the broad-based Black Economic Empowerment Act. That's an example for the honourable member. So, as I said, this means presenting a serious reform-minded South Africa that's willing to protect private property rights, uphold the rule of law, reverse triple B, double E excesses and regulatory overreach, and commit to market-friendly, evidence-based policies that will restore investor confidence and grow our economy. And it also means a decisive shift in foreign policy. Going forward, South Africa's global posture must be based on genuine non-alignment, on peace, on advancing and protecting human rights, and multilateral cooperation with both the global North and the global South, instead of ideological loyalty to outdated liberation era fraternal networks that do nothing to grow our economy and lift our people out of poverty. And we all know that this moment demands leadership, and we know that President Ramaphosa today will face a clear choice in Washington, a reset of relations or rebuke. And for the sake of jobs, growth, and our international credibility, we urge our president to choose wisely, and we wish him well with his engagements in the United States. That's all for now. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you very much, Honorable Powell. Honorable Makubela.
Thank you, Chairperson. My greetings to the colleagues, to the honorable members, and those that gave us the presentation. Chairperson, let me start with this question. The stakes in the US-Washington meeting today are high. That's the statement that came. But the question that we have as MK Party is, those stakes are high for who? Whose interests are at stake with this US-SA Pretoria Washington meeting today? Chairperson, the people that we represent that have voted in their majority in this nation, the people that are sitting in Giyani, in Limpopo, in KwaMhlanga, KZN, people that are sitting in Mabiskral in Northwest, certainly their stakes are not high. They don't even know what is happening with this US-SA meeting. They benefit nothing from it. They've benefited nothing over the years. There is no economic trickling of opportunities or any form of a job creation for them out of all of this, that the stakes are so high for, that the entire nation must be wishing the president well on this particular meeting, that the entire leadership, and I would say entire because every other minister here is delegated authority. The president, the deputy president are out of the country today when we are dealing with the most important critical element of what makes the state work, which is the budget. The president of this land has chosen the American Washington meeting with Donald Trump over the people of South Africa. Instead of prioritizing the budget in South Africa that has failed 2 times already, he has prioritized to go and sit in Washington. When our people here don't have jobs, we want to hear where revenue is coming from to provide basic services for our people. We want to know how our children are going to afford feeding schemes, transport to schools, how healthcare is going to be sorted for the poorest of the poor, how we're going to build houses, where is the money to make this state work and redress the injustices of the past. but the president has prioritized to go and sit in the US. That is relegation of duty. We don't understand why these stakes are so high that he could not give these people that voted him in, these people that have really borne the brunt of the hardship of the economy, that have enabled him and this so-called GNU who run around with blue lights, making all sorts of insinuation around our domestic laws, comfortably sitting in our land, sitting in our farms, telling us it's high stakes. They've been relegated to second class so that the US Washington meeting must happen. Chairperson, let me start here. The dynamics of the US-SA relations are increasingly untenable, particularly in the light of the ideological shifts within the US, the arrogance of President Trump administration. And we believe as MK Party that South Africa must seize this opportunity. We have to redefine our foreign policy by moving away from AGOA. We have to embrace alternative partnerships with Russia, China, and Middle East. These regions, they offer significant opportunities for trade, for investment, and geopolitical collaboration that align with our vision for multipolar global order. Furthermore, we believe that this country must seize this opportunity right now to provide leadership within BRICS, African Union, and champion the global South and establish ourselves as a powerhouse in Africa and beyond. And as MK Party, we want to urge that this administration must prioritize South Africa's sovereignty and alignment with the global South, with the regional powers here, and create our own trade instead of going to beg with a cap in our hand in the US-SA relations and the meeting that is happening today. Chairperson, ahead of this visit, we were very disturbed and deeply, deeply concerned as MK Party that President Trump, while our president is on his way, neglecting his duty, critical duty in South Africa to put together a budget to sort out the mess that we have in this country. President Trump has the audacity in his Air Force One to say South Africa is out of control. And I'm quoting, South Africa has been out of control for the longest time. And we are told in this presentation that we must not take a posture of fast and furious. We must be patient. We must nest the strategic diplomatic relations. Meanwhile, Chair, we are provoked on a daily basis. We are provoked because of our land laws. And this is a deep, deep contradiction. We cannot, as South Africa, even begin to start or beg for any relationship with any nation for that matter. The nation that does not understand our historical context, that does not understand the land relationship between our people, our struggle, and why South Africa is where it is in terms of poverty, inequality, and unemployment. If anyone does not understand our land and economic dynamics, that person cannot even begin to be an ally for South Africa, because that was the fundamental basis of our struggle. That's why so many people lost their lives, blood was shed. That's how we end up displaced in our own land. America has its own eminent domain laws that talks to their land. But they want to dictate to us that we cannot have our own laws that seek to redress the past in terms of land ownership and the structural economic shape of our country. That we cannot allow, Chairperson. The contradiction number two, that this Trump administration is against the deep state. Yet they allow people like Johann Rupert, Elon Musk, and the cronies that have tried and to interfere in our own democracy, in our own sovereignty. And they have organized this meeting that is taking place today. That is a serious contradiction and hypocrisy. We must accept deep state, but they are fighting against the deep state. The misinformation, and it is continuing even in this platform, that there's genocide, there are land grabs, there are race ownership laws or race-based laws. When your own GNU partners, people that are in government, a government that has adopted this constitution, that has allowed these policies to redress the past, yet you have a partner in this government who's advocating that South Africa has race-based laws. If that is not treason, I don't know what treason is. Chair, the other contradiction is the Starlink, which is also the basis of this relationship that is truly flawed with the US. MK Party raised a serious motion yesterday rejecting the Starlink, that it does not comply with the very laws of this country. It does not comply with the ICASA regulation laws. It has failed to comply with the BEE laws. And we cannot allow Starlink to operate out of those laws. It's undermining our sovereignty as a nation. It's undermining our digital sovereignty. It's undermining, Chairperson, our local empowerment policies. And if indeed, in any way, there is a discussion that is seeking to bring Starlink to this country as a horse trading tool or as some kind of a negotiating tactic or tool to assist the GNU in bringing the AGOA back on the table, we are going to have to do serious oversight, and it's going to be a serious rejection, not only from Parliament, but we will have to mobilize our people, Chairperson, to be able to reject this, because this is interference. This is undermining the sovereignty of this nation and the African laws. And if we allow it here in South Africa, it means the exploitation of South Africa by colonialism and also the imperialists is only starting its second chapter through this digital exploitation of Africa. Chair, we are really, really concerned that the complexities that have been highlighted by this presentation between South Africa and the US is really rooted in the ideological differences. And that is not something that you can horse trade in one meeting. It means our fundamental values have diverged over the years. And it tells you, as the honorable member was talking about, the relationship has been deteriorating. It's deteriorating for a reason. And if we are not able to boldly and unapologetically identify that reason and see it for what it is, then address it for what it is. And if we cannot admit that perhaps we have reached a stage where we have irreconcilable differences with the US and choose our different paths in peace, and there's nothing wrong with it, then we'll be making a mistake that many generations to come, Chair, are going to pay for this. We cannot afford to sacrifice our domestic laws to appease President Donald Trump, to appease a few minority business people who believe they own the economy of this land, who believe they own the sovereignty of this land. We cannot afford that, and we will not allow that as MK Party. We are going to continue to advocate, Chair, for the foreign policies that prioritize South African sovereignty and alignment with Global South. And we are going to ensure, by all means, and through the oversight of this committee, that AGOA is not going to compromise our socio-economic transformation goals as the nation. We speak, Chair, of global governance structures that we believe they are broken already, especially when it comes to our relationship with the US. We speak of human rights, justice, and multilateralism, but our practical national interests in the various departments are not aligned. We don't have a coherent strategy. And as part of the oversight of this committee, we have to look at an interdepartmental alignment in what we're doing. You cannot have agriculture and trade rushing and aligning with the US and their ideological posture, yet we have energy, we have our digital development, looking at Russia, looking at China, aligning with a different ideological posture. It clearly shows that there is no interdepartmental alignment, no coherent diplomatic strategy, and we have to fix this ASAP. And unfortunately, this cannot rest on DECO alone. While every other department, every other partner within the government of the so-called government of national unity is running in its own track, doing its own thing without coordination and alignment to the ideological posture of this nation. It's time that South Africa aligns its thinking, even as a bloc, so that we can lead regionally, we can influence regionally. Our ideological posturing, which results in the policies that we're advocating, the policies of transformation, the policies of inclusivity, the policies of regional development. We need a unified African bloc. We need to create alternative trade partners. And they are there. The markets are there. The US market cannot be our be-all and end-all, such that we sacrifice the interests of the nation. We sacrifice the struggle of our people to maintain a few $billion at the expense of all that we have been fighting for, all that for the past 10 years we've been struggling to put in place and redress the inequalities and redress the poverty and create employment for our people. Chair, we refuse that the Democratic Alliance believes it has a mandate from the people to protect South Africa, in their own words. It has a mandate to openly defy its own government of national unity and rush off to the US and conduct some kind of meetings or with their own diplomatic strategy that is in conflict with what this nation stands for. They must be condemned for this act with the contempt that it deserves. It undermines the collective and the coherent efforts that have been put in place by the policies of DECO. Our oversight, Chair, must start with the Democratic Alliance and what they are doing in their own party to undermine the sovereignty of this nation. We have to have a diplomatic strategy that is driven by national interest, not minority interest. And we have to restore the global image and the international image of South Africa. And the lies that have been peddled must be addressed. And this committee, Chair, holds the responsibility to provide that oversight. And I agree with the members that we should have the minister here. We should have the deputy minister here. We should have penalties in place that must be proposed to be imposed on those that continually undermine the diplomatic relations and posturing of South Africa in its entirety in order to further narrow interest. Chair, oversight on the African refugee saga. What are we going to be doing as this committee regarding the Afrikaner settlers that have purported to be refugees in the United States? And this government of national unity has been quiet in the face of this global spit in our face, where we are said to be having land grabs, there's genocide in our land. None of that is happening. And if the Democratic Alliance is so patriotic, why is there a narrow focus on the financial benefits of AGOA instead of redeeming the global image of South Africa in their patriotic pursuit with these relations that they are having outside of the formal and official structures of this government? Again, this is serious hypocrisy. If they are so patriotic, they should have been the first one to raise their hands and say there is no genocide in South Africa, because they live in this land on a daily basis. Chair, I'm going to move to look into some of the key things that have been raised by the presentation. One of the critical things which we are going to reiterate again is that the continued involvement in AGOA, particularly with the arrogance that has been displayed by President Donald Trump, including that they want to bring and they continue to bring juniors to the G20 meetings, which are supposed to bring together senior officials, including the heads of states at the right time. I think it's serious disrespect that South Africa, instead of being apologists all the time when we deal with the US, we note even in the tone of this presentation, it's almost as if we are being begged to be apologists. We must not raise any issues. We must not be wild because the US is going to pull out and therefore all of us are going to suffer, etc. We are suffering already. We are seeing hardships already. But if US is going to undermine the G20 in the manner that they are doing, why do we need to beg them to be a part of it? Instead, we should be strategically deepening our partnerships with Russia, with China, and the Middle East, leveraging our position with BRICS and the Global South to establish South Africa as a powerhouse, as I have said before. And we align with those who are aligned with our values of sovereignty, inclusivity, and equity. And we are, and we should use this position as a leader in shaping the multipolar global order. Chair, China is outpacing US in development and in innovation. They are not an authoritarian state. Iran is such a poor example to use in this context as well, because the growth of Iran was stifled by sanctions. Because of the US meddling, they were isolated for choosing their own path, for choosing to self-determine. And through their own Iranian revolution, they have managed to nationalize their oil. They have bet their own path, despite the meddling of the US. So that tells you that even in their own way, with their the Shia Muslim state, they have managed to turn their nation around. They have managed to create prosperity for all their citizens. Nothing stops South Africa to put South Africa first and have our own revolution that is going to serve our people. As NK Party, we believe that even with the BRICS, the new development bank must be exploited for funding of our infrastructure projects, for our national growth and sustainability. Chair, we can do without AGOA. there are options and there are alternatives. The Middle East, particularly countries like Saudi Arabia and UAE, have also emerged as global players in global energy and investment. And those are the countries that we should be looking to right now to create alignments and relationships. The presentation also talks about the Gramscian global order. But we need to now, as this committee, start to require the breakdown of what does that look like for South Africa. Chair, in our role as those that are tasked to provide oversight on the South African international relations or global developments, at this stage as South Africa, we have not even published a 10-year foreign policy outlook that aligns with our ideological posture, looking at our developmental inclusive goals and regional responsibility. The presentations and the speakers have told us that the Trump administration must not be seen in isolation of where America is going. This trajectory they're on, it's going to continue. So that tells us that we need our own charter and we must champion those reforms as South Africa. Reforms within the World Trade Organizations. What are we championing as the leaders in the region in terms of reshaping the architecture of these institutions? The UN Security Council as an example. What are we putting forward as South Africa that will serve South Africa, even our Pan-African agenda? Can we table some Global South Reform Charter to reshape some of these institutions for equity, inclusion, and representation so that we start to drive our own agenda and stop reacting to executive orders of President Trump or sanctions or trade shocks or ideological pressures? That's not leadership. We've been reacting and responding. It's time that this committee ensures that South Africa shows leadership, shows some balls, and shows some backbone in dealing with the global issues. The president said we are not going to be bullied. But if our president can leave an important sitting, such as the budget presentation, to go and beg the US to restore relations, that means we are junior, we are being bullied. Why couldn't this meeting wait until after the budget has been presented? Until the president and the Minister of Finance talks to our people on what it is that they are putting on the table as a budget to make this state work. What was the rush to Washington? Who is pushing the president of this land to rush to Washington to restore relations? Chair, we have known as this nation since September last year that the President Trump administration is going to look at the AGOA and even remove this AGOA relations or trade agreement with South Africa. But it looks like DECO and all our departments, there is no plan. There's no plan for sustainability beyond AGOA. It cannot be our be-all and end-all. They've just been talking about looking at alternatives. We're going to reprioritize. We're going to look at our foreign policy. But we haven't seen any strategy that suggests that we've got a plan beyond AGOA. Because that's what this nation should be looking like. It should be looking for a plan beyond AGOA. AGOA, if it stays in our own terms, good. But if it wants to stay in the terms that are not favorable, not in the interest of this nation, we don't need it. We should have that plan beyond AGOA. Chair, I'm going to now conclude with this following points. South Africa, our leadership in AFCFTA, the African Continental Free Trade, needs to be recalibrated needs to be accelerated. Our relationship with the China Belt Road Initiative also needs to be accelerated. We need to refocus on those infrastructure and development and the investments so that we refocus our attention from America. The instability of the US and the relationships, even their own internal instabilities within the US, must not affect South Africa's domestic and developmental goals. We stand as MK Party reminded by one of the speakers about the town hall meeting that President Mandela had in the US, and that has become the foundation and the backbone of our foreign relations and our trade relations. And we stand by those words that were uttered by former President Mandela as I conclude, that the US cannot and will not allow them as MK Party to dictate who South Africa's friends or enemies are. Money is not going to dictate whether we are making 3 trillion or 10 billion from the AGOA. It's not going to dictate who we are friends with or who we are enemies with. Our values rooted in what we have suffered as a country when the US was not even the first respondent to help this country. Our values rooted in what our forefathers have taught us to value, the friends that have stood with us in the darkest of hours as a nation will remain our friends. And we're going to deepen those relationships. They will help us, they will suffer with us, they will hold our hands, and we'll prosper with them. But the US is not going to treat us like South Africa is for sale. And if the president of this nation currently is going to sell South Africa at the expense of the deep state and influential few, there's going to be problems. We are not going to allow it. Through this committee, through MK Party, we will fight this for the people of South Africa until each and every South African benefits from every trade that is signed by this, represented through this Department of DECO. Every agreement that is signed must see its tickle effect and impact to the lowest, to the rural areas, to the least of South Africans. That's what we're fighting for, not those that are sitting in Washington influencing meetings to come and exploit this nation once again. Thank you, Chairperson.
Thanks, Honorable Makubela. Honorable Kumbalta, you have been confusing me because your hand is going up and down.
Yes, Chair.
And we have got time problems now. Over to you, Honorable Kumbalta.
Yes, Chair. No, good morning to yourself, Chairperson, and honorable members present in the meeting, and the members from the Institute of Global Dialogue. Honorable Chairperson, respectfully, I wanted to propose that given the limited time we have and the weight of the issues on the table, I was proposing that we reconvene at an alternative time because there's a lot to deliberate on, and continuing with the meeting now won't be as productive as we'd like it to be. Many of us haven't spoken, and we have many contributions we'd also like to make, but I would think because of the time limits that are constrained within us, rescheduling will allow us to give these matters the attention they truly deserve at an alternative time, Chair. I just wanted to put that proposal on the table. Thanks, Chair.
Okay, thank you, Honorable Kumbaka. There's another hand here, Honorable Mudise.
Thank you very much, Chair, for the opportunity. Actually, I would have also wanted to speak to the issues that have been presented to us. Indeed, they've been very interesting, taking into consideration the current dynamics that are happening between the South Africa and the US. But I want to also support the proposal made by Honorable Kumbaka, and probably we can allow the presenters to respond to a few issues that other members have already raised. but we then reschedule this session again for the next alternative date. I think most of us members, we still want to interact with the presentations. Thank you, Chair.
Okay. Thank you very much, Honorable Modise. Honorable Makubela, may you lower your hand, please. Sanush, we have a bit of a challenge in our hands. The buses from the villages are supposed to be leaving in the next 15 minutes or so. And we don't want to constrain you in terms of you elaborately giving context to the responses that you are going to give and your team. You may want to succinctly just touch one or two issues. There's a proposal that we proceed. When I look at the program here, we have an item which we can reschedule next week and proceed with these discussions of today next week. The advantage also will be that the US-South Africa meeting would have been done and we would have known and seen the outcome, which will then be included in the discussions that we will continue next week, Wednesday, if members agree that that should be the approach. But also we need to check with you, Sanusha, if you and your team will be available if we are to proceed next week with the discussion. But before that, Sanusha, there's a hand here, Honorable Powell.
Chairperson, I support the recommendation. May I kindly ask that through your office, you ensure that the Minister is present at the next session, deliberating the US-South Africa relationship and the outcomes of meetings in Washington this week. We really do need to be exercising our constitutional obligation and holding the Minister to account, and it's not possible to do that when he doesn't attend our meetings. Thanks, Chair.
Okay. I was going to come to that proposal, honorable members, and suggest that we separate the two. Sessions where we convene other people, institutes, and so on to come and share their views, their research with the committee. Well, it's up to us, but the minister doesn't have to necessarily be there. But we must have dates particularly and specifically dedicated to holding the executive accountable through the minister. That we should do, and we all agree to it, so that we also on that day don't lose time through presentations from whoever will be coming to present, but rather hold the department through the minister accountable on their core work that they should be doing as a department. So we agree to that. And I think one of the things we may have to improve on our side, other than obligatory appearance of the minister relating to budget and annual plans and so on, I think we must just insert in our program dates that the department cannot compromise throughout the year. If it's once a quarter, we put a date and it's set and it's agreed, then the minister has to come and appear, so that when they plan their trips overseas and so on, they must know that there are dates they cannot touch, because those dates have been agreed to among ourselves as the committee, and with DERCO, they would have been presented to them on time. So I suggest that we agree with Honorable Powell's suggestion, and earlier on it was also made by Honorable Mhlongo, that should be the approach, so that there's a regularity of appearance of DERCO through the minister and deputies in the committee, other than what is legislated in terms of the PFMA. There was a hand from Honorable Zuma.
Hi, thank you. I just also wanted to ask, if it's possible when the minister's around, could we not have these meetings physical as opposed to virtual? Thank you.
Okay. All right. I'm sure all of us, we agree to that proposal. Yeah, so we agree to that. We'll deal with that. Do we all agree, members, that we pause here and continue next week, Wednesday?
Agreed, Chair. Thank you.
Agreed.
Okay. Thank you very much. Sanush?
Thank you very much, Chair, and thank you very much to the honorable members for the discussion and the issues that have been put forward in terms of this presentation, but also in terms of how to go forward. From the IGD side, Chair, I've looked and I think, yes, we will avail ourselves to next week's meeting. I just need to check with Dr. Mthembu's diary if he's not traveling, but I'm sure even if he is, he will make himself available. So that from our side, we're very happy to come back and ventilate more of the discussion and have more of an interaction with yourself and the honorable members, and of course respond more succinctly but more interactively with the issues raised. There was a question in the chat about IGD's engagement with the Department on Research and Policy Recommendations, and we do have that engagement. We are involved through the DIRCO's training protocol. We have briefings with various desks around not just the US-South Africa relationship, but also more broadly in terms of the South African foreign policy, dynamics around the Africa strategy, issues of trade, economic diplomacy, because of the way in which DIRCO is the organizational architecture of DIRCO in terms of desks and so forth. So it's multilateral, bilateral, and going forward. And I think that's something that also needs to be considered in context of oversight as well, because of the way in which the organizational architecture is defined and characterized in DIRCO. It have these different engagements around the oversight, and we do that from that the IGD side, and we are engaged in various interactions and activities, like my colleague Arina Murison, who has a constant engagement with DIRCO around South Africa's foreign policy engagements, also on the training, and of course through Dr. Mthembu, who essentially oversees all of this stuff. So if we need to speak about that more in the forthcoming meeting, Chair, we will provide more detail on that. Just very, very succinctly, and I'm also mindful of the time and that you need to get to a very important budget speech. And that is just to maybe clarify a few points, not just one or two points regarding the presentation and regarding what was identified as contradictions, but what was also identified as, how do we define our strategy going forward? I know Dr. Mthembu spoke about AGOA. I just want to make sure that when we talk about AGOA, we understand that AGOA is not a free trade agreement with South Africa only. It is essentially a preferential trade framework, and it's done at the highest level within the US administration, at the presidential and of course the US government. So that is actually not a permanent fixture that was negotiated in that space, but rather it is a preferential trade architectural framework that can at any time at the behest of the US could have been withdrawn. So we have to be careful in how we identify it, how we actually consider and characterize it, because it may have happened in the context of how it happened now, but it could have also happened even before the time frame that was mentioned. So we have to bear that in the back of our mind. And so this is something that doesn't just affect South Africa, it affects the continent, and it affects other countries as well that are part of this African Growth and Opportunity Act, because it's a preferential market access. So we have to make sure we understand that. And therefore, when we talk about trade, we need to talk about what is the impact of our trade relationship with the US and vice versa, because it's not just elevating one over the other, but it's supposed to be an equal partnership in terms of the current trade architecture globally. The WTO is facing a lot of existential challenges. We know that the dispute resolution mechanism within the WTO has been undermined or has been defunct for the last couple of years, because there's been a challenge from the US around that the dispute mechanism. And of course now in some of that challenges around the trade challenges that haven't been ventilated in the WTO, the latest being the question around Indonesia challenging something under the WTO, but couldn't go forward because there's no dispute resolution mechanism to oversee the dispute. So we've got to also bear that in mind in terms of context. The last point I want to make, Chair, because I know that you'll want to wrap up and people will still have to get to the transport, is the question around how do we identify what are democratic states and how democracy is being defined to how that links back to democracy and development. I think very carefully and cautiously, we must not make the mistake of assuming, and I apologize for the noise if it's coming through, assume that democracy is equal to development. If we're looking at some of this architecture around democratization and development, and we're looking at it from a quantitative perspective, and the citing of certain institutions, again, the question is, what does it mean? Because if we look at the rise of illiberalism, if we look at the rise of populism, and we're looking at the shift in terms of how the spectrum in certain countries are shifting very much towards a spectrum that is almost ultra-right, then of course the challenge is these are democratic states that are having a challenge. And that goes back to the presentation in terms of this anger, this politics of rage, this politics of unequalness, inequality, and more importantly, intergenerational inequality as well. So I think there's a shift here that we need to also understand what that will mean, not just for whether there's an equation between democracy and development, but rather why are we having these politics of rage, these ultra shifts in democratic processes towards the rise of populism, and why is it fueling those dynamics? So we got to be a bit more careful in how we understand the logic as well as understand the push and pull factors, but what are the root causes of that? Because we are seeing in certain societies across the world, especially within the developed world, that the rise of populism is a reaction to something that's not taking place in those societies as well. And so that, if you read Rita Abraham, you'll find that this is something that is becoming even more important in terms of understanding, for example, how military governments also become quite, become quite au fait within the general public, because people are saying that the current architecture is not delivering. So I think we've got to make sure that we understand that. My last point, Chair, is on oversight. I think we've got to be very, very clear about what is oversight and how oversight is conducted with agency, with one voice, as well as having that kind of level of how do you want to approach oversight as an engagement? Is it bringing the executive and other stakeholders before the committee and asking them questions to then ventilate information, and how that information is then collated, assessed, and taken forward in terms of what is the oversight and what is the medium to long-term perspective of oversight, in terms of, is it only about accountability, or is it about also developing a strategy on policy? And I think these are dynamics that need to be looked at, because oversight is about a collective agency. It's about a collective voice. And so we've got to now think about that in the committee, for me personally, but also how do you get that in terms of what is the accountability you want in the short term, but what is the oversight you want in the long term? And I thank you there, Chair.
Yeah, the last one is a critical question, which we have to deal with as a committee. And thanks for that, Sanush. So on that note, honorable members, we are pausing. This is a pause until next week, Wednesday, 9 o'clock in the morning. Tomorrow we are meeting the EU, the parliamentary delegation, together with the Portfolio Committee on Defense. All the details have been sent to honorable members, and we'll see you this afternoon during the budget, and tomorrow at the Portfolio Committee with the EU delegation. Thank you very much, honorable members. Thank you to Sanush and your team. See you next week. Bye-bye.
Thank you very much.
Thank you,
Thank you,
Chair.
Chairperson. Thank you, bye.